What's up, buddy? You ready to record this thing?
I can't do this thing, man. My mouth is just too dry. This episode, nay, the entire podcast are in danger, Adam.
Okay. First off, you're being a touch dramatic. Second, we're literally sponsored by Flint's mouth-watering mints. The mint's specially designed to fight that dry mouth you got going on.
Okay, I'm listening.
How dry are you right now?
Drier than panties at Comic-Con, man.
You know, Flint's revolutionary F-strength effect helps you control just how wet that mouth will get. For a situation of stubborn cotton mouth, 250 F-strength, the lemon flavor will provide you a pleasant pucker while splashing your lips with a sizable amount of saliva.
Ooh, okay. Well, what if I'm just a little dry?
A 100 strength mint like their cool watermelon will satiate your taste buds while delivering a refreshingly wet mouth.
Oh my god, my mouth is so moist.
Yeah, I'm not sure how I feel about you saying that, but hey, if it means the show can go on.
Okay, so not only has Flint's Mint saved this episode, and quite possibly the entire podcast, but to show their continued love for our listeners, they're extending the 15% off promo code when you use it on their website, flints.com. It is historically higher. They weren't satisfied with just getting you high. They want to get you historically higher.
Go to www.flints.com and use the promo code historically higher. That's historically higher for 15% off.
Now, whether you're rolling a fatty on a nature hike or preparing to melt into the couch for a movie night, Flint's will conquer the cottonmouth coming your way. You shouldn't be thinking about mints unless you're thinking about Flint's.
Welcome, my new children, as Historically High tells you the story of one of the greatest tricks that I've ever played on the planet. I didn't have to send my satanic followers down to you. I just tricked you into believing that I was real. Now
Sorry I'm late, man. Are you ready? Are you already recording?
What? Everybody, rate, review, subscribe.
Were you doing a devil voice? Want me to step back out of the room and you can just finish whatever you were doing?
What? I was stretching my voice. I was getting ready for the episode. Don't you do that every episode
like
too?
Bumblebee.
Yeah, red leather, yellow leather, red leather, yellow leather.
Thank you for introducing me to this topic, by the way. It was an extremely frustrating 6 days of research.
My bad. I just like bringing you into my world sometimes.
No, the fact that this shows me how little true crime I've actually listened to, I have the understanding now that really my forced, not introduction, but like when I'm going down that road, it's usually because you recommended a topic, and they always are extremely fascinating. This one was just maddening beyond all belief, and it's fucking scary.
Yeah, you get a little bit of everything. Not a lot of joy here. This isn't going to be the most upbeat episode, but I mean, if we can make this entertaining and fun, I feel like we can do it. But there's a lot of shock, there's a lot of sadness in the beginning.
Yes.
And then it turns into just a lot of shock of like, oh, this is how this story ends. That's the conclusion. Mm-hmm. This is the conclusion that we all came to out of such a tragic event.
Yeah.
And the West Memphis Three, as Chris and I were talking about just prepping for this episode, this wasn't just the murder of 3 8-year-old boys.
What starts out as the loss of life of 3 boys ends up resulting in the loss of lives for 6 boys overall. And the pretty much the main 6 that are involved in this, the 8-year-old boys who were the victims of the murder in this circumstance, Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers. And then the 3 who were both falsely accused and then falsely convicted, Jessie Misskelley Jr., Damien Echols, and why can't I think of the third one?
Jason
Baldwin. This, if there's been a ton of documentaries out about this, I wasn't aware of any of them. I think it's the newest one that came out was West of Memphis, or
Yes.
one of the newer ones, which is insanely fascinating.
Peter Jackson did it.
Yeah, like Peter Jackson, Fran Walsh, like, Lord of the Rings stuff. They're the ones that actually they heard about this case and became invested in it, about the wrongful conviction of these 3, at the time, teenagers that were accused of this just fucking heinous crime.
And I mean, we can talk about how bad it is and give you guys kind of the overview, or we can just dive in and really get into it, because this wasn't an isolated incident. The murder's isolated incident, absolutely terrible. But the reaction to it is born out of something that has been going on, or I guess went on to some extent, still goes on in the United States, more commonly known as the Satanic Panic. And basically the Satanic Panic was this moral phenomena that went on. It started to spread through the U.S. in the 80s, kind of late 70s. And then it went beyond our borders in the 90s and kind of spun out of control. And basically it was a fear of any sort of Satanist, devil worshippers.
Cults.
Yeah, cults that, pledge their support to the devil. We didn't do a whole lot of good for our psyches, I think, kind of out of an entertainment factor, because we have stuff in the 60s and 70s like Rosemary's Baby in 1968.
So, spoiler alert, Rosemary's Baby, basically this young girl, Rosemary, is kidnapped by these cultists, and then she is to serve essentially as the vessel for Satan's child, and so Satan's going to impregnate her.
So there was a measure of creativity that came up with that idea. Like, that was... somebody had to have a thought and write a script for that.
They do, but when you really boil it down, is that so I'm not saying the premise, but making the bad guy he's the ultimate, he's the OG villain.
He's the movie villain that has lasted all throughout the ages.
Yes. He's behind everything, behind all of that horror. You get movies like The Exorcist and then The Omen that really lean into this type of like demonic possession, things like that.
73 and 76 too. Like we're seeing a spacing now to where it's like, okay, well, The Exorcist was huge in 73.
Yeah.
Let's roll that right into The Omen. And 3 years later, we have another spooky hit.
During this time, you also get this slew of basically like serial killers that all of them have these undertones of like either satanic rituals or satanic worship. We get the Fall River cult murders in 1979 to 1980.
Yeah, in Massachusetts. This was an actual supposed cult. Well, they were for sure a cult, but they were supposedly satanic, and they were all just kind of crazy. If memory serves, I believe this was like oh shit, I haven't done Fall River stuff in a long time, but it's sort of like a biker cult that was pretty big into drugs,
okay.
And these murders that were happening were a result of kind of running afoul of this group of people. Yeah, the big ones. I mean, Son of Sam was huge. Did you know that Son of Sam was a mailman?
Yeah. When I was listening to this, so like, I went too far down the rabbit hole of the Satanic Panic because it's going to get its own episode because it's much larger than I ever imagined it was. All the things that were tied to it, it's pretty insane. We're kind of just hitting a very brief Cliff Notes version because it sets the stage for what happens during this trial and how these 3, teenagers are actually painted out on why they would have committed, an act like this. But Son of Sam up in New York was a huge cause for the rise in belief of like satanic cults and worship. You also had, I believe it was the Night Stalker.
Richard Ramirez.
You had I think I mentioned the Tate LaBianca murders. So you had the Mansons, who people would, of course, say, of course it was a cult. I'm not denying that, but also that you could tie in essentially the free love movement, counterculture, all that stuff into like a worship that's outside of regular practice religion.
Yeah,
or what like this also led to the Satanic Panic is what led to the rise of televangelism and of evangelists, like things that were the fucking shaking in church and the huge mega churches and all that kind of stuff. That was born out of the Satanic Panic to kind of try to counter what people thought was a rise in like worship and just like what they say, the moral decay of society.
And it turns out that the moral decay of society that they were worried about were beliefs older than theirs, old pagan religions, Wicca type things. Where
it's Salem witch trial shit.
Yeah, you're celebrating the harvest. You have festivals to the gods and different things like that are start to look at as satanic. And then you have kind of the shit kickers, the guys like Anton LaVey starting the Church of Satan to not worship Satan, but to rub it in the face of good Christians.
Go back and listen to the Anton LaVey Church of Satan. We did it quite a while ago, and it's really fascinating. Come to find out when you're looking into what it wasn't even really about Satan.
No.
It was more about like some like capitalist beliefs and things like
self-indulgence.
Self-indulgence, about not, about freedom basically in their own way. But it wasn't. It was the gimmick was like the Church of Satan because it was so counterculture and it was so different to what, everybody else was going with.
We're going to do the Black Mass. I'm going to do a unbaptism or whatever he did with his daughter for the world to see, the Black House.
Yeah. But in an area where, the Satanic Panic has been going on since the 80s, we come to the early 90s, the places where that kind of stuff is going to gain the most traction, not in the form of like people practicing it, but where it's on, I guess, the lookout for most, or essentially it's the most shocking, is going to be the areas like the Bible Belt. Mm-hmm. So we end up coming to West Memphis, Arkansas, May 5th, go ahead.
Yeah, before that, kind of the flashpoint of the Satanic Panic.
That's right.
1980, there was a book written by a Canuck. His name was Lawrence Padzer, and he had a patient named Michelle Smith who had come in for therapy because she had postpartum depression. She had just lost a child. I don't think that's postpartum. I think that's just a miscarriage and being depressed.
Well, I don't know enough about it, but what I'm saying is afterward it's definitely a type of depression.
Yeah. So he went to Padzner to try to get, or she went to Padzner to try to get that under control. And it morphed into something that kind of changed the thinking of the Satanic Panic. Padzner basically used her in a way to where she had told him that she had a secret that she didn't know how to tell him and that she couldn't get it out. So he used something called recovered memory therapy, and he would do it through hypnosis. And he would claim in the beginning that as soon as he hypnotized Michelle, she freaked out for about 25 minutes and then began speaking to him basically in like a 5-year-old's voice. And over all this time that this is going on, I want to say it was like he had her under hypnosis for over 600 hours over the next 14 months.
Yeah.
And during this entire time, she's recovering these memories and telling him about how when she was 5 years old, she was taken to a ceremony through this crypt in a graveyard in this big underground lair.
By her mother.
Yeah, and a group of Satanists. And for 81 days, they would sacrifice babies. They would, this is going to be an unfortunate word that gets used a lot in this episode, but that there were rapes occurring, that the devil was sitting on his throne and his followers were worshiping him. And then she doesn't have any marks from any of these scars or anything like that because her and Pazner agreed that even though she was beaten and raped, Jesus, Mary, and the Archangel Michael rescued her and removed her scars
Showed up
from
like
her
the
body.
goddamn Avengers.
Yeah.
Like
the
we
A
needed
team
here, and it's them sitting in like the triple formation. Yeah, so Jesus, Mary, and Michael end up popping in and basically rescuing her from this and removing all her scars. At the same time, didn't they say that they had modified her memory and took that memory away because it would be too painful or something like that? And so they wanted to wipe that completely away. She went about living the rest of her lives, or her life. Nothing came about it. Her mother never took her to any other satanic meetings because it didn't fucking happen. But essentially using this recovered memory therapy and all of this shit, Pasner ends up putting this into a book called Michelle Remembers. This thing ends up coming out and catching like fucking wildfire.
Yeah.
And this goes and basically creates this crazy fucking movement that takes place during the Satanic Panic, where all of a sudden people are questioning everyone that works in a daycare, questioning people, kids, teachers, and everything like this for any whiff that there could be any type of like wrongdoing. I'm not saying that that stuff doesn't happen, but it's like full on witch hunt at this point.
They were on Oprah.
Yeah.
And as they were talking about everything in the book, Oprah ate it hook, line, and sinker and acted like she didn't ask any questions.
No.
She didn't ask any valid questions that you should have asked while this happened.
Was that
I don't know
Oprah's book club?
Probably.
Book?
The whole thing just blows me away that they were on all this daytime TV and nobody questioned them. And of course, when this book comes out and the police start looking into this stuff, like, oh shit, that's happening in our town. Maybe we should check this stuff out. They go through and start looking at these things. Like for 81 days, she was in this crypt during this big long ceremony. They go to her school, they check her attendance. She has perfect attendance.
Yeah.
So clearly that didn't happen. They check her over. She has no scars everywhere. Well, Jesus, Mary, and the Archangel came down and cleaned me up, so that's all good. Okay, well, were there any reports of more missing children or people during this time if they were sacrificing babies and there were all these followers? Oh, no? Okay, so what about this story is true?
Yeah.
They just broke everything down to the point to where there was no really wiggle room about it. But that's the stuff that doesn't come out immediately. That's the stuff that only gets printed in the back page of the newspaper.
Yeah.
It did the damage that it needed to, and anything beyond that, if you didn't believe it, you were out on it. But if there was even a shred of you that believed it, it started playing in your mind.
This led to just a slew of insane accusations across the entire country of people getting in trouble for things they never committed. Kids, this is a delicate subject because you have to believe and you want to be on the lookout for this. But, this led to a bunch of instances where kids were saying that somebody did something that they really didn't do. And, as soon as someone's name comes up, even associated with anything to do with kids, even if it's attracted, as we're going to kind of find out later in this story, the damage has already been done in those scenarios. And so there's this hypersensitivity kind of in the country right now for anything to do with having to do with either Satan worship, occultism, things like that. And that's going to play. And the reason that we kind of went into that is that plays an insanely huge part of the trial of these guys.
We got to bang out the McMartin thing first, just real quick, just an abridged version of the McMartin trial.
Okay.
Because A, I want to mention Chuck Norris, and B, I want to explain that children that should be taken seriously pretty much all the time until they start talking about people flying around on brooms and accusing Chuck Norris of touching them.
Yeah.
So 1980, the McMartin preschool trial happens in Manhattan Beach, California. The genesis of all this was a woman named Judy Johnson reports that her son had been sodomized by her ex-husband and also by a McMartin teacher named Ray Buckey. He was the grandson of the school's founder, Virginia. Judy believed that her son had been sodomized because he didn't go to the bathroom for a few days. Not that he was just constipated or anything like that, but she believed that somehow the act of sodomy stops you from needing to do a number two. It would turn out that she was severely, I don't want to use the word mentally ill.
Okay.
And that this whole fascination that she had come up with was...
That bitch is crazy.
just nuts. But she said enough magic words that the investigators immediately jumped on the McMartin preschool. And as they were going through it, there's a way that they were interviewing these children to where instead of asking them if anything funny was going on, they would pay the attention to them to ask them if anything inappropriate had happened with the teacher. Now, when you're speaking to children, granted, I don't have any, but you have to kind of word things in a way to be specific more so than general, because generally you're going to get some pretty wild-ranging answers from children as far as like, did dad say a bad word? And your kid's like, yeah, he said poop. It's like, well, not a bad word.
Yeah. It's almost a form of you have to, and this is going to come into play later, but you almost have to kind of like lead them, but also understand that with the child's imagination, they will grab that and then just run with it because they want to tell you a story about it, but they're going to go and involve what you are telling them you want involved in that story.
Yeah. So when they say, hey, does anything inappropriate happen around this preschool? You get these children coming forward talking about play or laying with animals, or teachers flying on broomsticks, or toilet portals that brought them down to hell. There was one such part of this.
Your daycare did not have a toilet hell portal?
Buddy, I was too big for the toilet portal.
Okay.
I was scared of it. I was definitely scared that it was real.
That's where they sent you when you were bad.
But they latched onto this one thing because the kids said that they played this game called Naked Movie Star. Now that sounds terrible, right? Why in the world are children in a preschool
game?
talking about naked movie
game
stars?
You play on the internet.
Well, they didn't realize this was like one of the rhyming games, like a patty cake rhyme that they would play, or like banana fana, faux fana, whatever that is.
Chuck Bobuck.
Yeah, something like that. So they took them as serious until they actually figured out what it was. There was a point in time where they were even so desperate that they were showing kids pictures of the teachers and asking them if they had done anything wrong. But in order to try to, I guess, keep it fair, they would mix in pictures of other people. And this led to one child claiming that Chuck Norris had come into the daycare and molested him. I don't know if Chuck Norris has ever spent any time.
Say it ain't so, Walker.
Yeah. I don't think Walker, Texas Ranger, ever did that. But in the end, this trial went on for, what was it? From 1987 to 1990. And over that time, there were 360 kids that had claimed abuse. There were 41 that were used at pretrial. There were 12 that were actually called on the trial to testify. And eventually by 1990, all of the charges were dropped because they didn't have, they had enough to get a grand jury to say, yes, we need this to go to trial. But once the trial happened and they started realizing that these kids just had imaginations. There's absolutely nothing wrong with having an imagination.
It's such a fucking dicey conversation because it's like, yes, you do have to believe that shit.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about that case in detail when we actually do the Satanic Panic episode, because painting it out like that, you need to get kind of into the nitty gritty about discussing kind of what came up during the accusations and how crazy some of them were. And then they were basically just trying to latch onto the ones that had some merit of kernel of truth. And then they kept losing that, and it kept getting smaller and smaller.
Yeah. To jump down to West Memphis, Arkansas, we'll introduce the players, the first three in a group of players. Then we're going to talk about kind of how they came on the radar of the police as somebody who was ripe for the picking if anything were to ever go wrong in the city or in the town, basically.
Do we want to kind of describe the events that had occurred and then get to the individuals?
Yeah, just because we got to walk through Damien.
That's true. Okay.
We got to walk through his life.
Okay.
So, Damien Echols, born Michael Wayne Hutchison. I assume Wayne is a name of royalty in trailer parks.
Oh,
like it's.
You added that last part on there. I was like, fucking royalty, really?
It's.
Are you basing that off Bruce Wayne?
No, I'm basing it off of the name Wayne and just seeing a butt crack hanging out of a jean.
Yeah.
What's like the royal family's last name?
Windsor?
Windsor. Yeah, this Wayne is like Windsor of the trailer park, I think. But that's odd because his name's not Damien. he was born December 11th, 1974 in Marlin, Arkansas, to his parents, Joe and Pam. This is tough to describe. When I say his family was dirt floor poor, dirt floor poor was a literal meaning in his life. They were that poor.
One of the common themes that each of the boys that were accused and convicted of this share is that they're all very come from very poor families.
And that was such a big influence on his life, was these people were so damn poor. And I don't know if I really have it anywhere else, but they were so poor that at one point in time after Joe and Pam split, which was a very toxic relationship that will come around full circle in this entire story, but they split. Pam ends up getting together with this guy named Jack Echols. And Michael, now Damien, or will become Damien, loved his dad. He didn't want to put any extra pressure on his dad. So in order to be able to take the child support necessity for him and his sister off of his father, she convinced them to let Jack Echols adopt them. And during his name changing, going from Hutchison to Echols, he decided to change his name to Damien from Michael because he had read about a priest that had worked in a lepers colony named Damien that then, I guess, became a saint. Mm-hmm. So there's some religious connotations, and the reason that he has kind of this odd dichotomy of religious and not religious was down there was just kind of one religion. It was...
would be Southern Baptist?
Yeah, something along those lines. Catholicism was a very different deal. Being a Catholic in the Bible Belt at that time didn't sound like it was the greatest thing in the world. Excuse me, but... he was very exploratory in his religion. Jack was just kind of an asshole. But Damien was a kid that could almost try to figure out, okay, you're a bad person, but there's still part of you that's good. He said this about his mom. He said that his mom was very dramatic and she could really only love him in a way that she knew how. So shit like he would have an asthma attack and she would be trying to find his inhaler while she had a cig in her fingers while they were both inside. So she was trying to help. Jack was an asshole. Jack was also a where did Jim Jones kind of get his start on the people that dance with snakes?
Keep going, we'll figure it out.
Oh yeah.
Revivalist?
Is sort of a revivalist way. It was a lot of you're going to hell, apocalyptic, you've sinned kind of behaviors.
That Old Testament shit.
Yeah, that were going on in Jack's church. And Damien had just kind of had enough of it. And to give Jack credit for all of the times that he beat Damien, for all the times that he would beat his mom, for all the bad things that he did, whenever Damien would go through these changes and these metamorphoses, Jack would always kind of just be like, hey, things are changing in his life, but he's trying to find out who he is. And through religion, when he said, hey, I don't want to continue going to this crazy, destructive church of yours, I want to try Catholicism, Jack drove him to the Catholic Church. He didn't tell him, no, this is what our family believes in. You're going to just stick with this church. He's like, yeah, I'll take you there. When Damien started to grow his hair long and shave one side of his head, when he would get a piercing, when he would eventually find his trench coat in a literal dirt floor shack that they lived in the middle of a field that constantly got sprayed with DDT because they were living in the middle of the field. Every time he would go through a change in his life, Jack would just tell his mom he's trying to find himself. So even though this guy was an awful, awful, terrible individual that just is so bad to Damien and his family, Damien can still look at him and be like, yeah, but there was a couple good things about Jack.
And you listened to Damien's audiobook about this.
Yeah, it's a fantastic audiobook. It's so odd to hear this episode or do research for this episode and then listen to the book, because you kind of get this thought that even though this case is going to go so far south, there had to be something bad about these kids for them to zone in on. And like Damien had to be a little bit crazy. And then you listen to the audiobook and it's actually him narrating it, and just to hear the way that he thinks and how he's self-deprecating, it's not like anybody that could commit a murder like this.
It's because at that age, I felt like I was guilty at the same type of stuff that comes up during this case about like judging somebody by the way they look. And then you look back on it, it's like, he was just kind of and I'm not even going to use the term odd, but he was the kind of kid that just kind of did his own thing.
Yeah.
He knew what he liked. And especially in some place like West Memphis, when you like things that are a little bit more alternative to that way of thinking, you're going to stand out like a sore thumb and people are going to have their opinions of you.
And it was anything from his musical taste. I'm sure, I don't know what Arkansas's greatest,
Hard
greatest
rock band?
Yeah, art, something like that. It probably involves a washboard, but he loved heavy metal. He loved anybody like Metallica. And it even, in his audiobook, he talks about how his music taste grows even beyond heavy metal to where he's listening to punk music when he figures out that he loves skateboarding and goes through this skateboarder phase that everybody went through. Not me. I wasn't ever
there.
Yeah, I wasn't ever a skateboarder, but I watched it happen to so many kids.
Yeah.
And it's a phase that I'm sure everybody's had band t-shirts. I'm sure not everybody, but most people have worn Globe skate shoes because that was cool at the time.
Dressed in monochromatic colors.
Yeah, just anything like that. And after that, he sort of transitions into more of what he thinks and what is generally thought of as a goth. He already had naturally pale skin and jet black hair, but he said that he would actually powder his face to look more like a vampire, not because he wanted to scare people, but because he just thought vampires were cool. And unfortunately, when you do these things, you do start to get bullied and you start to get negative reactions. And there were situations where he had a couple years where he just carried a dog skull around with him. That sounds crazy. But then when you hear him say, I would rather be bullied for something that I can control than something that I can't, there's part of you that's like, oh, fuck, you're just a kid, and that's what kids do.
You're just trying to make it through the best way you know. You know how. You're figuring it out.
Yeah, and you're so fucking poor. And everything is going so wrong that if you can get any joy out of life, you kind of have to follow it. He would be diagnosed as a manic depressive. Listening to his audiobook, he has the highest of the highs and he has the lowest of the lows. And a lot of them are just in that typical kind of roller coaster fashion.
And even at a time, again, we're talking about the early 90s at this point. That kind of stuff isn't really like front and center as far as mental health goes.
No.
You're just bummed out.
Yeah, and especially in a place, there's going to be a lot of bad shots taken at people from Arkansas. I'm sorry. I'm just going to get out in front of it and say it now. It's because this case is so maddening and frustrating that it's going to happen. I don't think everybody in Arkansas is dumb.
No, it just happens to be most of the people front and center of this are just really shitty representations.
Yeah, I don't know what mental health in the 90s looked like in Arkansas. I don't imagine it was pretty great, and there's other reasons that we'll talk about with the other two boys coming up. But he was a little bit of a ladies' man. He was kind of smooth. He had a first love, and he was able to attract different women. A very gross 30-plus-year-old, too, that'll come into play later. But he found his first love. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. Mainly, he was friends with Jason Baldwin. Jason Baldwin was born...
The way that you put that in was that his first love with Jason Baldwin.
It kind of was. As weird as it sounds, but like a platonic love, like a friendship love.
Yeah, kinship.
They became brothers. Jason Baldwin, born April 11th, 1977, so he's going to be 3 years younger than Damien, or two-ish years.
I think, yeah.
Yeah. They formed this relationship in school through music. And Jason wasn't nearly as poor as Damien, but he still wasn't in great shape. His father left. His mother was a schizophrenic woman. And when she was on her meds, everything was great. She was holding down her job. Everything was good. But the issue when you don't have all of the understanding of what these meds are supposed to do, when you're feeling good, you would assume you don't need the meds, right? Mm-hmm. So she would kick back off the meds, and once she was off of her meds, she would go out, and she might not come back for a couple days. And this kind of built up Jason as somebody who loved his mother and understood that she was sick. So when she would work at night, he would make sure that his siblings were fed, that they would be ready to go to school in the morning, all that good stuff. He was a real responsible kid, but he also loved heavy metal too. And when Damien and Jason saw each other, it was like in a study hall or something like that. Damien had seen that he had on, I believe it was a Metallica shirt, and then he was listening to a Walkman, and he said that they never really got to talk because all they had was study hall because they were in different grades. Mm-hmm. But when they were in there together, one of them would pop the other one's earbud, or they would figure out how to both listen to the same tape at the same time.
Yeah.
And they really, really started to kind of just become best friends and brothers.
Well, I remember that Damien, during one of his interviews, would talk about how Jason was like a really talented artist. He was really good at drawing, but the things that he liked to draw were not the things that like the art teacher was telling him to draw. So he would be drawing like kind of more like maybe a gothic type like picture or something like that, or he was drawing a skull or something like that. And the teacher was like, we're doing like fruit today, even if it was really good. So they were trying to kind of stifle that. But at the same time, like, you know, these kids are just trying to make the best of kind of what they have. But these two finding each other, especially where there's probably not a lot of people at all like them, they really do form this brotherhood, like Adam was saying.
And it's not to say that just because these two kids are different, they're different as far as being two conservative kids or being too off the edge. They were just kind of like everybody else. They were a little bit of delinquency. Yeah. We're talking about kids that are just walking around on the street at all times. And I'm not saying that all kids get in trouble when they just roam around, but there's going to be a chance that they're going to do some dumb shit. They're going to break some windows.
Especially in a poor income area. Like, that's just kind of how it works.
They're going to run from the cops every once in a while. That's what kids kind of do. And maybe I'm just saying that and trying to justify that that's what I did too, so I can draw a little bit of a parallel between myself and these guys.
The emphasis here is there's a big difference between being a kid and breaking a window or a B&E and fucking murdering
murder.
Three little boys.
Yeah. Finally, we come to Jessie Misskelley Jr. He was born July 10th, 1975. So again, he's a little bit older than Jason, but still younger than Damien. He was born in West Memphis. Jessie Misskelley Sr. and Betty Jo were his parents, and Sr. was a massive booze bag. This guy was an all-time alcoholic. And to compound that issue, Betty Jo ended up leaving the family when Jessie was a child, like a young child. And on top of all that, he was small. To go one step further, he was one of 11 children on his father's side and one of 9 children on his mother's side. So if you're little and you have that many siblings and you end up with that many step siblings at the same time, you're going to get picked on a lot.
Yeah.
And you have to know not only how to fight your siblings, but then you are going to probably have to deal with it at school too. So he was kind of known as a fighter. The major thing that you have to know about Jessie is I think he always wanted to do the right thing. Unfortunately, he wasn't blessed mentally. He had the IQ estimated between like 67 and 72 as far as what test you're looking at.
It's what's considered extremely low. It's what they would consider like mentally disabled.
Yes.
Okay.
But another bright spot in his life was he wanted to be a pro wrestler. He loved wrestling. And unfortunately, it's ironic that what happens to him is very much what happens to Brendan Dassey in Making a Murderer.
Yeah.
Like, very, very close to how those two things went down. He was held back in high school. He had these behavioral issues. And another just really poor...
It's a common theme.
Yeah, a bad draw. Yeah. They were very poor.
It's a poor area is what it is. So
when he would meet with school counselors, when they would send him out for evaluations to diagnose these behavioral issues, they would always say, you need to get him into counseling. You need to get him into sessions. He needs to be talking to somebody. But those things aren't free. And when you have to choose between feeding your 11 children or
you're
going...
one of 11 on the dad's side, one of 9 on the mom's side, like you're not getting any focus.
No. So try as they might to get him the help that they needed, eventually financially you can't get him all of the help that he needs.
I don't think they even got him any help, period. I don't think it was even... I'm not saying that like in a trying to be a dick or anything, but I just see this in a situation where out of that many children, there wasn't even an attempt to help him.
No, but also I do think that his dad was, even though he was just a historic alcoholic, I think that he probably wanted to try because for some reason Jesse loved his fuck up father as much as he did. There had to be some sort of a mutual love there too.
You would hope.
There's this funny excerpt from the book that's the first time Damien meets Jesse. And Jason was over at his house. They show up over there. And Damien said that when he walked through the door of the trailer, all he saw was this kid with his shirt off, spinning a flare gun on his finger and eating a cheese sandwich. And across his chest, it was tattooed bitch. And when he went to ask him what he was doing with the flare gun, he got yelled at from a girl on the couch. And it was his girlfriend. And instead of getting her name tattooed on him, this is a 16-year-old kid. He got bitch tattooed on him for her. And the cheese sandwich that he was eating, as his father rolled out of bed in the afternoon to go to work, he asked him if there was any cheese left. And Jesse pulls the slice of cheese out of his sandwich and he goes, "I'm not finished. You can put this in your sandwich. This is the last one." Like, just this little rascal, mischievous kid.
These kids aren't doing themselves any favors, man.
No, they're not. He also, I believe, he was the one that had the unironic mullet. Like the really good, like the pure stuff. Like Colombian cocaine of mullets.
Like, it's not to say that these kids don't have there's a big difference between just minor infractions and like what these guys are accused of. They're essentially accused because they can be.
And don't get me wrong. When I say this all with love. I'm not disparaging of any of these kids. It's just so perfectly Arkansas, some of this stuff.
These kids are 100% a product of their environment and a victim of circumstance.
And not even Arkansas. Every state has this. Every state has these kind of people. And most of the time, they're pretty good people. But unfortunately, the socioeconomic situation that they find themselves in lend them to doing more desperate things.
Maybe just don't get bitch tattooed across your chest.
Yeah, that could be good. Also, the spinning of the flare gun on the finger seems like a bit of a mischievous thing. But Jesse was a pretty interesting kid. By the age of 17, Damien had dropped out of school.
So we're going back to Damien.
Yes.
Okay.
Not because he wanted to. He was dating a girl in school named Dina, and Dina was the first Wiccan that Damien had ever met. He, falls in love with this girl at a recital that his sister is having, and he's out front and she was passing out the flyers. And the way that he describes this girl was disturbing to think about a 17-year-old talking about another 17-year-old, but apparently she just oozed sex. And her family was very religious. But she had this secret belief in Wicca. And his first introduction is her showing him in her room all of these different books that she had about the healing powers of nature and plants and how to be one with the world. And Wicca, although it gets tied in with witchcraft a lot, it's not devil worship. It's literally just a way of worshiping the planet and understanding that there's magic and things around you. It's nothing demonic. There's nothing bad about it. It was just a pagan belief that she had that she couldn't tell her super Christian parents because they would look at her weird. Mm-hmm. But Damien was that kind of weird. It's funny too, because Damien said that he liked the idea of Wicca more than he liked actual Wiccan beliefs or the people that practiced Wiccan beliefs. Yeah. Because he said that they were just kind of like crunchy granola people. So that was more of that grungy goth punk that saw these people.
Some stereotypes are real for a reason.
Yeah. If they had electric Hondas back then, he's like, those are the Wiccas. Yeah. Those are the people that drive...
Prius.
Yes, a Prius. But they fell madly in love. This was Damien's first love. Unfortunately, his parents did not really like the way that he dressed, the way that he acted.
They didn't like Damien.
No. But part of it was because Damien was more outwardly showing these same beliefs that their daughter had. And so they would end up being forced to break up after, I don't remember what happened there. So him and Dina would break up. Damien would actually end up fighting Dina's new boyfriend. And when her parents caught wind of that, they're like, you can't be anywhere around our daughter anymore. This just isn't going to happen. Well, Damien and Dina end up getting back together. And the only time they can ever see each other is in school because her parents had the clamp down on them. So Damien and Dina decide to run away together on the last day of school.
Of course.
Yeah, it's star-crossed lovers. It's a tale as old as time. So, after this plan comes together to run away together, I believe the trailer park they ended up all living in, besides Dina, was Lakeview. Is that what it's called?
I have no
Will you
clue.
look it up and see what it was called? But it was this trailer park that Damien lived in, that Jason lived in. On this last day of school, him, Dina, and Damien end up breaking into this abandoned trailer in their park. And as they're in the park, they're going to stay there one more night, and then they're going to be off at daybreak. Jason ends up leaving to go home to take care of his little brother and sister, or the younger kids in his family, because that's what he did when his mom went to work. Mm-hmm. He was a good kid. That same night, the police had got wind that they had broken into the trailer and ended up busting open the trailer to find them both in Porky Pig attire. Their tops and no bottoms, as two 17-year-old kids are going to do when they're alone in a situation like that.
Your top off.
Yeah. I mean, it was an abandoned trailer. It might have been cold,
You also at the same time, you don't want as much of your skin. You want as little skin touching surfaces as possible, probably.
Yeah, we have a mutual friend and family member that actually only took one leg out of his pants when he was
That's true.
attempting coitus.
He only got the half Porky out. Yeah.
But Damien and Dina are both arrested. Damien is charged with burglary and sexual misconduct. Dina ends up getting to go home, and there's really no history of if she was actually charged with any of this stuff. No,
she's not charged. It's a classic, and I'm not saying it's a trope, but it's the kid from the other side of the tracks, the girl that has a respectable family in town. Something happens. They both are charged with wrongdoing, and he takes it all because he's the one that can be pinned on. So that's essentially what happens. Deanna doesn't get in trouble. It's easier to pin it on Damien because there's no way that he can fight any of this. He's just going to have to go and take it. So because of this, it basically puts Damien in the system and kind of on the radar, specifically this guy named Jerry Driver. And he was the guy that was put in charge of Damien for his probation after he went to juvie for a little bit.
He goes to juvie. While he's in juvie, this guy who, it's very funny that they point out that Damien is a devil worshiper throughout this entire thing, when people like Jerry Driver were actually far more devilish and far more bad, just all around than any of these kids ever were.
Evil.
But Jerry was into the Satanic Panic, and he sees this kid come in for this burglary and sexual misconduct. He sees the hair, he sees the clothing, he sees the style, and he goes ahead and keeps him in jail. He ends up talking to Pam and Jack Echols and basically says, hey...
Joe. Oh, Jack, yes, yeah.
Because Joe's out of the picture at this point. Says, hey, here's the deal. I am either going to hold him in jail here until his trial, which is months away, or he can go to this mental institution and see if we can get all the weird out of him. See if we can get this satanic panic stuff out of him. So when forced with going to a mental institution or hanging out in a jail with adults before your 18th birthday, you're still 17.
I'll go to the mental institution because there's nothing wrong with me.
Yeah.
I'll be able to at least walk around, but this will actually prove, and I can talk to somebody that will actually show that I'm not fucking crazy.
Yeah, and at this point in time, Jerry is starting to put these satanic pieces of the puzzle together and believing
there are no pieces. He's putting the
in
imaginary pieces of the imaginary puzzle.
Okay. That Damien is kind of this Satanist figure that he had heard about and that he had heard from all these other people in all these other different places of these satanic cults. And Damien kind of seems to fit this mold. because he has these sort of Wicca different beliefs where he asks him questions about the Bible and he's like, yeah, man, I'm not really religious anymore.
It got to the point during the Satanic Panic when like law enforcement was making videos like those fucking just like what to do in this situation about how to like deal with like satanic cults, like cheesy as fuck stuff where basically they would have like a woman lying on a table and be like, sometimes the satanic cult will carve their symbol into a woman's stomach, and she's literally laying there and just has it like drawn in Sharpie or magic marker, like complete and total just bullshit.
This is the Reefer Madness type cartoons. Yes. Or type ads.
But this is the kind of stuff that a person like Jerry Driver is just fucking eating up, and as soon as he sees that, he's like, I know what this guy is.
He whacks it to these things. And he believes that Damien, not being an ardent follower of the Lord and kind of supposing these Wicca beliefs, I think at this point in time he asks him if he believes in God, and Damien responds by saying, yes, I believe in God, but I believe it's a female.
Yeah.
And that kind of throws Jerry through a loop.
Non-traditional religious beliefs, basically.
Yeah. So Damien ends up shipping off to this mental institution, and he actually doesn't mind it. This is how poor he is. He says that the breakfast at the mental institution was the best breakfast that he had ever had in his life. That's how far removed from middle-class society he was, that the mental institution served him a great breakfast. But at this point in time, they're starting to look at him and try to decide, if he is this depressive, if they need to start medicating this. But he does really, really well in the psych ward. And even to the point to where they're getting ready to release him, what he finds out the day that he is going into the psych ward and he can actually talk to his family again, as he talks to his sister on the phone, finds out that Pam divorced Jack and that his father, Joe, has moved back to Arkansas, and that him and his mother are getting back together again. So not only are you going through this weird transition of you get separated from the love of your young life, you're in a psych ward, but all of a sudden the family that you wanted back more than anything because Jack was such an asshole is all coming back together again. Turns out that Damien's little sister had accused Jack of sexually abusing her, and that's what spurred Pam away from getting rid of Jack. And Joe would just swoop back in at the right time. Jack didn't seem to ever really face any repercussions, and when push comes to shove, hearing as much as I've heard about Jack, I would tend to believe his sister that there was definitely some improprieties going on. But Damien's doing great in this institution. Ends up finding out that he gets a 24-hour day pass. All of a sudden, Joe and his mom, or his dad and his mom, show up with his sister, and they have this 24 hours where they get to stay in a hotel. They get to have pizza. One of their favorite things to do as a family is they rent horror movies and watch these old bad horror movies together and make fun of them and enjoy them. It's like a core tenet in their house that's just how they grew up, loving horror movies together. So they're doing all of this together. Then, after this 24-hour hold, they say, you're good enough that you can go wherever you need to go. And his father, Joe, had actually moved out to a place called Loha, Oregon, that's outside of Portland, and had ended up putting himself in a position to where he was managing gas stations and actually making okay money, to the point to where when they moved out there, they had an apartment, everybody had a room, everybody had a situation that was all pretty good. And so he ends up leaving. They take, I believe it was a 5-day road trip across the country from Arkansas to Oregon, which seems like just a god-awful drive. It would not be fun. But this whole way, he's reconnecting with his family, and he's actually happy that all this is going on, that his life's going to change for the better. All of this poor, bad life that he had to grow up with, that's kind of morphed him into the person that he is all going to be left behind, and he can start anew in Aloha, Oregon. So they end up heading over to Oregon. He ends up getting a job at a gas station that his dad owns. He works with this old Vietnam vet that was just kind of like an old curmudgeon, but he said that he was like the oldest friend that Damien would ever make. They got along really well, but at the same time, every time he had a spare moment, he was thinking about Deanna. He was thinking about this woman that he loved, this girl that he loved. The last thing that she said to him was, after this is all over, will you come find me? And he said that he promised that he would. So he ends up
one day deciding to call Deanna's house, has his sister answer the phone, say, hey, is Deanna there? Hands over the receiver to him. She's on. He goes, hey, is everything okay? She goes, yeah, where are you? He tells her, he says, is anybody listening to the phone call? She says, yes, they are. He says, well, do you still want me to come find you? And she's kind of like, I don't really know anymore. Turns out that Deanna got some deprogramming during the time that Damien was in the mental institution, and had kind of gotten her off of the idea. I mean, as far as kids go, first loves flowed in and out. I'm sure her family pressed her into just dropping this whole entire thing. But Damien's pretty bummed out about this because he just lost his first love for the second time. And to go along with that, he's fighting off this depression. One night, when they get out to Aloha, Oregon, dickhead Jerry Driver goes ahead and contacts the juvenile facilities out in Oregon and tells them about Damien and basically tries to transfer his probation to the people in Oregon. Well, he goes and he meets the probation officer in Oregon and they have a talk. Probation officer in Oregon's like, we're going to put you on the lowest level of watching you. Mm-hmm. We are going to have check-ins really only when you feel like it or if anything goes wrong. I'm going to let your parents know if you're doing anything that they don't like to go ahead and give me a call and I can come talk to you. He said that the law enforcement that he met in Oregon was night and day better than it was in Arkansas. Yeah. One night he ends up trying to mix a little bit of Kahlua into his chocolate milk before he goes to bed. Again, he's 17, so I don't know how he's getting this Kahlua, if it was his parents or whatever. But he's in this funk about Deanna and ends up ignoring his mom and dad. He gets in an argument with them. Mom calls the probation officer, talks to him, and this is an immediate betrayal in Damien's eyes, that she would narc on him because she was so obsessed with this drama that the probation officer comes up and ends up talking to him. There's talk about him harming his parents or himself. He gets sent to another psych ward. And while he's in there, his parents come and talk to him, and he knows that his dad is kind of a loser and that his mom betrayed him and doesn't really want anything to do with him. So when they say, well, what do you want to do about the situation? Do you want to come home? He goes, no, I want to go home. I want to go back to Arkansas. I want to go back and be around the people that I cared about the most. So he ends up taking a bus ride all the way back to Arkansas as a 17-year-old, just a wild bus ride where he tries to get talked into being like in the circus. Like he's riding the bus with carnies and they're trying to get him to come join the circus with them because he's still an odd looking guy. Yeah. And these people are kind of odd looking people too. But he ends up making it all the way back to West Memphis. He stays with another friend. There was a girl named Dominique that he ends up having a child with later on that we'll talk about. That was his kind of girlfriend / side piece while he was dating Deanna. She just gravitates right back towards him. He goes and finds Jason. Jason never knew where he ended up for the months that he was in Oregon. All he knew was that he got arrested one night and nobody had seen him since. He thought that he had just kind of dropped off the face of the earth. He said that when they moved out to Oregon, his mom left basically all of his shit in the trailer. And Jason said one day they were just walking by the trailer and saw all of Damien's stuff out on the side of the road. He goes, well, did you pick any of it up? And Jason goes, no, it was on the side of the road. We just figured it was all the trash that nobody wanted. But he starts this life back over in West Memphis. And of course, that butthole Jerry Driver ends up showing up again in his life. And he takes him back in and says, this is what you're going to do. You're either going to go to jail or you're going to get your GED and I'm going to need you to move back in with an adult. I'm thinking, okay, that's fine. Unfortunately, the adult that he was talking about was his old adopted father, Jack Echols. Jack Echols shows back up because Echols adopted him. So technically, he's the legal guardian. Yeah. So he has to go back and live with Jack. Jack's a shitty roofer by trade. He ends up working with Jack for a very long time and just hated it. He lived with him. He worked with him. He couldn't get away from this guy that was just constantly yelling at him, not letting his friends come over or anything like that. During this whole entire time, he's kind of back to dating Dominique. They're having sex again. And eventually, when you're somebody who's not really looking towards the future and living for today, you'll forget to wear a rubber. He ends up getting Dominique pregnant. And when Dominique gets pregnant, He calls his parents back in Oregon. He had a grandmother. It was his paternal, so his father's paternal.
Yeah.
Paternal grandparents lived there. Every time he would go over and see his grandmother, she would cook for him, and then she would call his parents, and they would have a conversation on the phone. One day, Damien's having a conversation with his parents as they're rebuilding this relationship. Damien says, hey, Dominique's pregnant. And they say, oh, well, guess what? We're moving back to West Memphis. So everybody loads back up from Oregon, comes back to West Memphis. They end up buying a trailer, and I believe it's called the Lakeview apartment or Lakeview Estates. I think it was Estates because it was real fancy. Yeah. And Damien's world is still intact. He's got a baby on the way. He's spending time between living with Dominique and her mother, who's also disabled, in their trailer, to living with his parents. He still has his friends around him. And his world is kind of heading in one direction, and he sees that this might be the rest of his life. They're talking about after the baby comes getting married, and this is just kind of his existence. Before we get into the bad stuff, do we want to pop out for a bathroom break?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay.
All right, so we come to West Memphis, Arkansas, May 5th, 1993. 8-year-old Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers are doing what 8-year-olds do. They're outside. They're playing around. They're having fun. They're wanting to stay out till the sun goes down and then even past that. So they end up getting together. I think the last time that those three were seen, they were seen by some like neighbors or people that lived on the streets that they were riding down. It's one of those communities that I think certain sections of town, they're used to seeing certain kids. Everyone kind of knows everyone to some degree.
Back when all the kids just played out on the street, when you knew your neighbors, when they knew you. Stevie Branch was born November 26th, before we get into that, this becomes something pretty important because they were first reported missing at 7 p.m. by John Mark Byers, who was Christopher's stepfather. So to get into it, Stevie Branch, born November 26, 1984. His mother was Pam Hobbs. His stepfather was Terry Hobbs. He was the oldest of two, and he was pretty excited because I believe his grandparents had just purchased him a new bike. So he had a flashy new bike that he wanted to show off to his friends. His friends being Michael Moore, who was born July 27th, 1984. He was the son of Diane and Todd. He'd also just received a pretty new bike, and he went over to Stevie's so they could play together. He was the youngest of two. Our third poor soul in this was Christopher Byers, the son of John, the one that reported them missing, and will come into question later. Was born June 23rd, 1984. His mother, Melissa Byers, his stepfather, John Mark Byers. He was the youngest of two as well. They all go missing. Nobody knows where they've gone. Searches that night were pretty limited just because it was getting dark pretty quick. It's May, so you're starting to run into the longer days, but at the same time, May, it still gets dark fairly fast. And so the searches were limited. They did canvass an area that was known as the Robin Hood Woods. The Robin Hood Woods were pretty notorious for kids going and playing in them. This seemed like a pretty bad patch because I think it was like right behind a truck wash, and they said that Robin Hood Woods was full of mosquitoes, and it was just a pretty rural area, I think.
Yeah, so there was close to a freeway there. I think was a truck stop behind kind of the woods, but it was an area that, like, when you live in that kind of area and there's certain places you can go out, like those are the areas kids go to play.
Yeah.
It's just how it works.
Hide and seek, build forts, whatever you want to do out there.
Now, as far as the last neighbors actually seeing these three boys around 6:30 p.m. that night, that information actually doesn't come out until they start doing the investigation. So this is essentially just an instance where, John Mark Byers is out looking for his kids. He can't find them, reports them missing at 7, gets a few people together, and they try to do kind of like a shoulder-to-shoulder search throughout the area, to see if they can find people. Law enforcement's responding at that time as well, but they're not doing a really active search. 8 a.m. the next morning is kind of when everything kicks off for everyone, fanning out all of the law enforcement in the area, sending out people to look for these kids, and they're not having a lot of luck until during a sweep of the Robin Hood Hills around 1:45 p.m. on May 6th. A detective or, an officer finds a shoe in this like little muddy creek area. Well, as he, calls someone over, he ends up like getting into the creek area. I don't know if he falls in, but he's walking around and ends up feeling something and hits him. And I don't feel like going into a ton of details on this, frankly, because I have a young kid, and during this part of the documentaries, I had to kind of like look away, just not my bag. But they basically pull out the bodies of these 3 boys.
Yeah, this stuff is rough. Anybody that has children, I don't blame you for not wanting to see it. This is an episode where usually we say, hey, go look at a map or anything like that. I don't suggest looking at any of these pictures.
No,
I've seen them. They're going to stick with me for the rest of my life. I somehow can compartmentalize this stuff to where it doesn't get me. So a quick overview. Just, I don't want to get too graphic and too into details. They were pulled out. They were naked. They were hogtied. The only reason that I mention this is because of the way they were hogtied. It was right ankle to right wrist, left ankle to left wrist. The interesting thing about this was out of the, what would that be, 3 times 2, out of the 6 different tie-ups, there were different knots used on different boys.
Yeah.
So not to plant anything, but if one person had done this, the fact that they were switching their knot tying seems to come into question a little bit, because if you were just one person, you just tie the same knot over and over and over again, right?
Well, I would imagine.
Yeah.
There's a lot to talk about this.
Along with that, their clothing was actually pushed down below the water, and they were stuck into the ground using sticks so they wouldn't float. Assuming that this all happened the way that it did, the reason that the shoe came up was because it just came off of one of them. The binding agents that were used were the kid shoelaces, so black and white shoelaces. Along with that, when the bodies were removed, they went ahead and sprayed this whole bank down with something called luminol. Luminol, I believe it reacts to the proteins in blood, and under black light, it gives you a little bit of a pattern to see it glowing under the light.
Yeah.
They went through and swept both sides of the canal just to kind of see if anything happened. They did get some luminol pickup, but it was kind of agreed upon that while they were doing this, they were only detecting luminol in areas where they had been put after they had been pulled out of the water, which if you have an incident that takes place in one area like this, there's going to be large pools that luminol is going to react to. But for the most part, the scene was pretty clean. To kind of get along from that stuff, one of the big major issues here was they weren't going to like private channels when they were talking about this stuff over the radios. So anybody that had a police scanner was hearing all of this information that was just piling out of these police officers' mouths about what's going on.
And they're calling in reports to have people taking this information down and everything.
Yeah. So as those are being intercepted by the local press, a lot of the details that they're pulling out of this initial finding when they first come onto the scene are getting reported instead of being held. The main thing that you want to do when you're trying to figure out who committed a crime like this is you want to give away enough details to maybe get people's minds moving, but you always want to try to hold things back, because as you're interviewing people, if they hand off a clue or say something that wasn't ever reported, oh shit, well, he only knows what happened at the scene, and if he wasn't, he had to have been there to know that.
Yeah, you have to control the flow of information enough to where you're giving enough information out that you can have an active search for people knowing about something to call in, but not at the same time to feel like you can't use known information to help incriminate somebody.
Exactly. And along with all that information that they're handing out, they're also getting things wrong. They're assigning names to victims that have different wounds on them, and they're getting those wrong. So there would be questions about who was wounded where and how. There was also a question, again, going to get back into another raw one, that there was sexual assault that they had seen possibly on these bodies that could have led the scene to believe that there were rapes that occurred on these boys. There were also stab marks, bite marks, and on one of the boys, again, another rough one, they described genital mutilation. They said
castration, I think is what it was.
Yeah. Some real rough stuff. So what do? You bust these boys off to the ME so they can get a better look at. But at the same time, where do you start? Who would commit a crime that was this heinous in this town where everybody kind of knows everybody, and there's some people that are definitely a little bit more off than others, but at the same time, you always feel this sense of community.
So these two officers, James Sudbury and then Steve Jones.
Steve Jones is the one that pulled the kids out.
Yeah, they felt like, just based on the crime scene and everything, how it was, that there were some overt cult ties, or, type of stuff that were going along. The kids being tied up, the mutilation, bite marks, that kind of shit. And so, of course, they're putting out information to see if anybody in the area, other officers, parole officers, know of anybody that could be in the system, because that's who they tend to try to go to first, to see if they have any recommendations. And ding, ding, ding. What's the guy's name? Jerry Driver. Jerry Driver ends up is like, you know what? I know this one guy that's definitely into that devil shit. And from that moment that he makes that connection, that's pretty much what primarily puts the focus onto Damien Echols at that point.
Who else are you going to blame? It's not like May 5th.
Okay, hold on. So here's the first thing instantly wrong about that. In any situation, you always have to question the family members first.
Yeah.
The people that have, and
Okay.
and I'm just saying that that just seems like a common sense perspective. You have to question the people that are closest to them. You don't go and try to find somebody that fits a weird theory you have that's based on how they were tied up or anything like that. I'm just saying this whole thing, as we're going to find out, is just a mishandling of pretty much evidence, of testimony. Anything that you can think of that can go wrong in this case does end up going wrong for Damien and those other two.
Yeah, everything's a bad... The worst case scenario happens pretty much every single time.
So you don't have Damien being officially announced like as a suspect, but from pretty much, right from the jump, he's being brought in and interviewed way more than anybody else on a fairly consistent basis.
Well, why wouldn't you jump to a kid who dresses a little bit different instead of, doing what I think anybody else would do in that time, would be to try to figure out if there were any sightings of suspicious people, maybe around the Robin Hood Woods at that time, or around that time, that same night that those kids went missing? And maybe they did, because on May 5th at 8:42 p.m., there was a black male that entered a Bojangles chicken restaurant covered in blood and disoriented, ends up making his way into the women's bathroom. He had a soft cast on one of his arms, and he ends up rubbing up against the wall and leaving these blood stains and smears. So the manager calls the police. And you'd think the police would rush right over. They would go inside. They would swab down the blood. They would try to get as many samples as possible, right?
I still think this was insanely mismanaged, even in hindsight. Good old Officer Regina Meek that responded to the call through the fucking drive-through window.
They didn't even go inside the building.
No. Now, hearing this, hey, depending on how the call went and describing him and everything like that, when this technically hasn't turned into what it is, because this is still the night that it's happening and it hasn't been discovered, these bodies and everything like that, you get that call. Of course, you go in there, you take pictures, you ask people some questions. So you have information regardless if it ends up being a guy that cut himself trying to change the battery in his car and was coming in there to clean himself up, or in case he was someone that did some really heinous shit and is trying to get himself, get rid of his clothes and get rid of some evidence in the bathroom. You still have to go in to do that due diligence. So they really fucked up there, because not only did that not allow the investigation into that for the information that it could have been that person, but it also makes it to where you couldn't then really rule out whoever that was. So that was still something that was floating up in the air.
Oh, well, you couldn't rule it out, but the next day when they hear about the kids going missing and then being found, the manager calls the police back again and is like, hey, you guys remember when you came and took the interview through the drive-through window? Well, yeah, you didn't...
When you got the report in a 5-piece with taters on the side?
you didn't come in and really do anything with the scene. We haven't cleaned the scene up. Do you guys think you'd like to come over and maybe scrape some blood off the walls?
Yeah, I just heard of an event in which there was something involved that may have generated quite a bit of blood.
Yeah.
Maybe this needs to be looked into a little bit.
So they end up showing up. They get some blood scrapings. We'll talk about those later because it's very interesting how that all plays out. But at the same time, they begin to come over and meet with Damien and do these interviews. They end up wrangling him and taking him down for a polygraph test. And during all of these different question and answer periods and investigating that they're doing into Damien, first off, the polygraph test results were never revealed. But an old police tactic when you believe that somebody's guilty and they pass a polygraph is you say that there's some inconsistencies in some of the ways that they answered questions.
Yeah.
And if you can't prove that there were inconsistencies because you don't keep the paperwork.
You don't want the evidence working against you. If the evidence can't work with you and can't work for you, the evidence doesn't exist.
But you can say that there were some concerning things that show up on the polygraph test. Along with all of these interviews and this investigation that they're doing, fucking Jerry Driver is still over there. It was Bryn Ridge was one of the men that was interviewing Echols, and he'll come in a little bit later on too. But they're asking him questions along with Jerry being like, so do you believe in God? What's your favorite scripture? What do you have a favorite book in the Bible? All of this shit that has nothing to do with the investigation.
They're trying to essentially create a damning character
that
is capable of this, trying to create someone who people think is capable of something like that rather than know that the person actually did it.
Well, it also turns out that way back when Jerry Driver sent him to the psych ward, he had gone in and told his mother that he had to search Damien's room. So he had taken some journals from Damien's room, had noticed some occultish, in his words, stuff.
I mean, there was stuff in his journal that was definitely like more of like paganistic. I don't know if the term could be paganistic or anything, but he had a journal that had like a pentagram on the front of it, which the pentagram was first and foremost, I believe, a sign that was used during like pagan worship festivals and everything. But that doesn't, those are the musings of a fucking kid.
Yeah, I mean,
that is just like rebelling against his thoughts and everything. He's not writing about like murder and all that kind of shit. And it's just odd stuff and stuff that people in that area, the people that are going to be judging you, aren't going to look favorably upon. During one of the interviews, they were asking him like, and I don't know how they even get to this line of questioning if you're just asking, but Echols ends up mentioning some type of like mutilated genitals or something like that, and they basically just hone in on that, and they're like, okay, well, because you knew about that, you have to have details, so you must have done it. When in reality, because this stuff was also over the airways, this stuff was also in a smaller area in a community, if any of this stuff gets out, it could simply be one of the officers that was working it is getting a drink at a bar. He has a couple drinks and he's talking to the guy and he's like, it was fucking horrible. This is what happened. All of a sudden, that guy is now having a conversation with everybody in that bar. It gets back to people's houses, and you're going to always hear and remember about the most sensational parts of that type of story. So him knowing that doesn't make him have inside information. It means he just has information that he probably heard throughout the fucking grapevine in this town because the investigation had a ton of fucking holes in it.
Everybody knew this shit. Everybody saw all of these or heard these different rumors around town. Not to mention the police force was offered help from the Arkansas State Police, but they declined the help.
Yeah.
Now, part of that was because their drug unit and a few of the detectives were under federal investigation for some things going missing in the evidence lockers.
Yeah.
Which that could be a problem. But at the same time, they're want to keep that investigation separate from this investigation took away a lot of their power. And there were a lot of people within this group of police that had loose lips. There's a lady that's about to come in here that I wouldn't normally say this, and I don't mean to be crude, but I believe she had 2 sets of loose lips. And she would cause a lot of problems in this case.
So taking you back just a little bit because it kind of also sets the stage while all this is happening. So the day after, or the day that the bodies are discovered, there's a woman named Vicky Hutchinson. She's taking a polygraph down at the police station for theft. Now, her son Aaron, who is there with her, essentially creates such like a fucking commotion and shit that they aren't even able to get the polygraph during this thing. But somehow mentions murders and describes a scene that is basically painting these satanic worshipers, these Satanists who are also speaking Spanish. And he mentions that it was like out by this thing called the Playhouse. And the Playhouse was, I believe, out in the Robin Hood Hills, which also kind of makes sense because if you're going to go build a playhouse or a tree fort or anything like that, you're going to do it in a wooded area.
Do these guys justice. They were wearing dragon t-shirts. They were speaking in Spanish, singing songs about the devil. And the reason that Aaron and his friends would watch them is after they would do all this weird stuff, they would then get naked and fuck in the woods.
I don't really know how you understand that the words are about the devil if they're in Spanish. But hey, this kid is like, what, 5 years old?
He's got a hell of he's 8. He's 8 just like the other boys. He's got a hell of an imagination.
That's right. So they're like, so they go off this information, and because he happens to mention this place in the Robin Hood Hills, they all of a sudden think this kid has all the information. So on June 1st, she agrees to almost act as like an informant to try to bust Damien Echols, and they're trying to essentially create a sting operation to get him or get enough evidence in order to arrest him for this murder.
It was her idea. She jokingly said, would you like me to go undercover?
That's right.
Because Jessie Misskelley knows Damien, and Jessie has babysit my children before, and we all live in the same trailer park, and I could get an introduction through Jessie to Damien. Please jump on this.
Like, are you fucking kidding me? Like, this is your fucking operation, is you're going to try to use this person who you just had in for theft? So
you're going to use a 30-year-old to try to entice an 18-year-old.
Yeah. Exactly. Like, what reason does he have to be hanging out over at her place and everything? So she agrees to basically bug her house for a recording. She sets out like some occult books like out on her coffee table. And then Jessie is able to essentially kind of make this. I don't even know how it went down that like, hey, this weird lady over in like 3C wants to meet you. And they go over and see her. Like, she's nice. She gives me muffins sometimes. But goes over there and they have a conversation. The recording you can't really hear. Of course, there was a conversation about like, hey, did you hear in the news, all that stuff? And then I think Damien mentioned that, he's like, they keep questioning me about it. She's like, well, did you do it? He's like, no, I didn't do it. Like, of course I didn't do that. So all of a sudden...
Why, strange lady, are you asking me about these murders and if I did them?
And this is going to explain, this timeline is going to sound fucked up, and it's because it is. June 2nd, the day after, she comes back in and she's like, oh yeah, I just actually remembered when we were talking about the Damien stuff. This just came back into my head. So 2 weeks after the murders, which would be the third week of May. So sometime around like May 20th, May 21st. 2 weeks before this, or a week before she was even talking to them about this, says that she went to a Wiccan event where Damien Echols talked to her and admitted to the murder. Now, she described, I think, the fact that they all started like getting naked and doing some like fucked up stuff at this Wiccan.
Are you talking about what's Sabbats?
Yeah, it was like a Wiccan festival or something like that. She says it started getting really uncomfortable, and so she asked for Damien to actually go ahead and take her home, and they left. But during that time frame, she just remembered, oh man, yeah, I did hear him talk about how he admitted to the murders and everything.
What are the key details there, though? She, Jessie Misskelley, and Damien all drove to this witch party out in the woods in a red...
a Cavalier.
A red Ford...
Escort?
Escort, yes. An Escort.
Such a great name for a fucking car, by the way.
And kind of fitting for Vicky.
A horrible car to actually pin that onto.
So, the reason why this is interesting that I got to point it out is Damien mentions in the autobiography that he'd only ever driven 2 times in his life. And one of them was with his drunk stepbrother And then the other time was a completely different time, but she said that he drove her and Jessie in this red Ford Contour. She ended up getting uncomfortable and wanting to leave, and Jessie jumps out of the bag. He's like, fuck it, I'm going to go get me some witch ass at this place. Well, it turns out that everybody knew Jessie didn't drive. Everybody knew he didn't know how to drive. And when it came time to find this red Ford Escort, it didn't exist.
Yep.
So there's some interesting discrepancies in this story.
Yeah, and a lot of this is going to be us telling you what happens and then telling you and jumping kind of ahead to let you know what ended up happening and if this was legitimate evidence or not.
Yeah, and this whole entire thing, it'll come out, thankfully, that Aaron and Vicky finally have a crisis of conscience way too late. But there's a reason why we know all this stuff, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Excuse me. But their next plan is that Vicky will ask Jessie Misskelley to come over to her house because she's concerned about a prowler or something like that. And she needs a man in her house besides her 8-year-old son. So Jessie, being the lovable goof that he is, says he'll come over and he'll sleep on her couch and he will keep her gun under his pillow on the couch to make sure that no intruders get in. Well, while that's happening, I forgot his name. Gary Gitchell is the investigator's name, I believe. Gary Gitchell shows up to the house and he shows up with Jessie's dad and he says, hey, Jessie, I need to question you downtown. Is it okay, Mr. Misskelley, if I take your son downtown with me? And Jessie's dad's like, sure, that's fine. You're a policeman. Why wouldn't I trust you?
Yep.
They end up taking Jessie down there and they immediately start questioning him. Now, there's a big issue here because while Jessie's father gave them permission to take his underage 16-year-old son, they did not give him permission to ask him any questions or to interrogate him.
Yep. So Jessie was 17, I think.
He was 17?
16. Yeah. So this is happening in such rapid succession. So this is June 3rd. So June 2nd is when she all of a sudden has this recollection. Vicky remembers this fucking little occult thing that they went to. June 3rd, Jessie Misskelley is interrogated for 12 hours. Now, out of this 12 hours of interrogations, there's only two segments that are recorded, and they add up to a total of 46 minutes. During this time, and these recordings have been released, even the ones that they had recorded to where they could try to use those as evidence of an admission, the coercion and the amount of leading is so fucking evident. And it's also completely evident that this kid is scared shitless and does not know what to do. He has an IQ of somewhere in the 70 range. He's just been arrested and brought down to the police station, and now they're questioning him about this murder. And as they're providing him information, they're asking him about times. He's talking about like, oh, this happened at noon, and then we met at noon. Come to find out, they're all in school at this time. He said he saw the kids on that day. He said the time that he saw the kids, they were all accounted for in school that day. They walk him through and basically keep stopping the recording. Then all of a sudden it'll pick back up and he's like, oh, well, what time was it again? He's like, well, it was 4. He's like, no. He's like, you just told me a second ago that it was between like 6:30 and 7 that you saw these kids. And going into even like the video portion of the interview, you can just see him hanging his head. And he's basically just like, I just want to go fucking home.
Yeah.
And they even tell him at one point, they're like, you know that there's like a $35,000 reward that for information that's going to lead to the arrest of the people that did this. And all he's thinking about that time is like, I've never heard an amount of money that large. I love my father. And they're like, yeah, you could buy your dad a new truck. And all of a sudden he thinks that he doesn't know what the repercussions of this stuff is going to be.
No.
They're throwing his friends' names at them and be like, were you with Damien? You were with Damien there. And were you also with Jason? He's like, Jason was there. Yeah. And they basically just lead him through this story. It's almost like during the breaks, they're telling him the story. They start the tape. They want him to then tell the story back to him, and when he doesn't get a detail right, they're like, no, remember in chapter 7 when we actually like discussed this portion of it? And through this 12 hours of, interrogation, are able to get essentially a confession of the involvement in the murder of these 3 young boys with Damien and Jason.
Well, and it was so shitty, too. I listened to the confession probably twice just because I was so flabbergasted. This is the definition of what they call a bad confession. Along these lines, when you're trying to get a confession out of somebody, you want them to control the narrative and to tell the story. And like Chris is saying, they're providing these leading questions. They're saying things like, were you and Jason and Damien in a car together? What car were you in? So before he can answer whether they're in a car or not, he's asking what car they were in, just trying to get him to continue this line over this entire process. And I'm sure this is just the 46 minutes recording. I believe Jason, what's going on? Jesse takes himself out of the story 6 different times. He says that he goes home.
After then, that's when I left. And he's like, no, and then instead of listening to him say, and that's when I left, they're like, so when they were doing this later, what were you guys doing? It's like they're completely ignoring the fact that he's stating that he's not even there anymore, and they're asking him to describe details when he just said he wasn't there.
8 different times he gives them during the day of when the time changes. There's a portion of this interview where I think that there's a chance that these cops are just assholes, and there's actually a better than good chance. I know they're all assholes, but were they just showing it now? There was a time when they asked Jesse about the stabbing, and basically Jesse leads them down this path of saying he stabbed them. They say in the face. He says, yes, in the head. He also started stabbing them in the bottom, too. They say, now, Jesse, what do you mean by the bottom? Are you talking about your penis? And he says, yeah, in the penis area. So he goes, so it would lead us to believe what you're saying is that this boy was stabbed in the penis. And Jesse goes, yes, in the penis. And he goes, you know what a penis is, right?
Yeah, they are obviously fully aware of the mental capacity of this person. There was a professor of sociology at Berkeley that they brought in as like an expert during the case, and he was an expert on false confessions and coercion, and basically testified that his interrogation, he's like, you couldn't get a more textbook case. Like, we would use this as an actual example in class about obvious coercion and false confession.
Unfortunately, that testimony did not get to be heard by the jury, and we'll talk about that during the case.
Yeah, that's just going to kind of let you know what kind of case this is going to be, where pretty much anything that the defense has to try to use that is just common fucking sense, that is trying to call to light all of the holes in the story of the prosecution, it's not going to be admissible, and it's not going to be allowed during the trial, which is what's so fucking maddening about this entire thing. So shortly after this, on the 3rd, Echols and Baldwin are both arrested. They do go ahead and question, they have other suspects, as they, I believe, kind of have to make a show of. They have to have it within record, because my view on it is this. If, let's say, they don't go after anyone but these 3, during the court case, they're leaving themselves open, and I'm not saying rightfully or wrongly, they're leaving themselves open to basically saying, like, so did you question anybody else about this? Did you get any details about where the whereabouts of other people were during this case to take out? Because you're saying for certain it was our clients that did this, but you obviously don't know where anybody else was. So you can't say for certain the possibility that anybody else could essentially be suspected for this. So John Mark Byers is actually questioned. He's the adopted father of Chris Byers. Now, some of the other family members are questioned, but strangely enough, and this will come back in a big way, one of the people that's never really questioned or interviewed is a man named Terry Hobbs, and he's the stepfather of Stevie Branch, correct?
Yep.
So a couple other people that are kind of suspected in the beginning, I believe just kind of as token suspects, Chris Morgan and Brian Holland, they were West Memphis teens. And 4 days after the discovery of the bodies, they actually just kind of bolted for California. And basically, this was kind of brought to the attention of law enforcement. They ended up calling over and finding where they were in California. California authorities brought them in for questioning. ended up getting blood samples and urine samples. I think they gave one of them a polygraph that might have indicated deception. He said at one point that he drinks and does a lot of drugs and that he's prone to blackouts and memory loss. So, yeah, I mean, I guess I could have killed those kids, and then immediately kind of like recants his statement, but they don't even allow any of that admissible. They send back the blood and the urine samples, and they pretty much just get left on a shelf and don't get looked into at that point. They already have their people that they are going to fit the narrative to, that these people definitely did it. And so the blinders are on, and they're not paying attention to pretty much any other details.
Well, are they valid suspects? I'm going to say yes. And not to say that Jason, Damien, and Jessie are valid suspects either. But at the same time, if...
Are you saying aren't valid suspects either because of the...
none of these people are valid suspects until we get to a couple that we'll talk about later. But these two guys, and one of them admitting, hey, maybe I blacked out and did this. If you had done it, that's the last thing you would ever say, is that maybe you did it while you were blacked out.
Yeah.
And B, you would also know that because if you were blacked out, you would definitely be able to wake up and see the carnage that you caused on yourself and then realize 4 days later that you got to get your ass out of town.
Yeah.
So they're not great suspects in that regard. But at the same time, even if they were, the Arkansas police, like you say, they had tunnel vision. They are focused on Damien, they're focused on Jason, and they're focused on Jessie. One of the things that comes out of this, beyond the just complete neglect of that, is Jessie ends up getting a lawyer. The guy that's assigned to Jessie's name is Dan Stidham. Now, Dan Stidham...
We're very pro Dan Stidham on this podcast.
Great guy. He goes in and starts talking to Jessie, and at first thought, he goes, okay, well, he confessed. I got to start working on a plea bargain. I got to make sure that this kid doesn't get the chair. And through going through all of everything that he knows about Jessie, he's talking to him, and he goes, hey, tell me the story. Give me your confession again. Gives him a confession different from the confession that was recorded. Do it again. Gives him another confession different from the last two confessions that he had just heard from him. And he kind of starts to piece together that Jessie didn't do it because he can't tell the same story twice.
Yeah.
And to go along with that, he finally comes to realize through the way that Jessie's speaking to him that Jessie doesn't know what a lawyer is. Jessie has no idea that Stidham is on his side trying to defend him. He thinks that Stidham works for the police department.
I think at one point Stidham asked him what a Satanist is. He's like, they keep saying
Stidham.
Satanist.
And
he's like, so he's essentially been convicted of being a Satanist involved in this, and he doesn't even know what a Satan like.
I think that's a little punched up, but at the same time, he just doesn't have the capacity to understand this stuff.
Maybe he didn't even mispronounce it, but just because you know of it doesn't mean you can be like, well, I know what the word Satan is, but what's a Satanist?
Yeah.
Like,
he said that it was in some sort of a pamphlet that was handed to him by a religious guy. I'm sure a lot of this stuff happened. I just don't know how Jessie would ever kind of come to asking that question. But as soon as Stidham realizes that A, Jessie doesn't know what a lawyer is, so he doesn't know that he gets a defense, and B, Jessie doesn't understand the gravity of the situation. Jessie doesn't understand that he could be going away for life or he could be getting the death penalty. There's no recollection of anything that's going on. Jessie just wants to get home to his dad. That's all he's focused on doing. And he thinks if he pleases enough people and tells enough people the right things, they'll let him go so he can go home.
it's exactly like that Brendan Dassey thing for the...
Yeah, it's so scary how similar those two things are. All Brendan wants to do is go home and watch WrestleMania. All Jessie wants to do is go home and see his dad and see the next wrestling event on TV.
So one of the things that also came up, and I'm trying to remember, Jessie was the wrestling fan, right?
Yep. Damien was too. Damien tells an excellent, little aside, Damien tells an excellent story in his in his biography that he writes, Life and Death. It's fantastic. Listen to it. It's like 10 hours long. Read it. I don't give a shit. Either way, it's awesome. But he talks about being a kid, and this just hit me so hard because he grew up in Memphis, and his favorite wrestling show to watch always involved Jerry Lawler. Jerry the King Lawler was the biggest thing in Memphis wrestling. So big that he had like a talk show that would happen on Sundays. And Damien said that there was a lady, an old grandmother, that would walk down their street with bubble gum, and she would try to entice the kids to go to church. So she would give them a piece of bubble gum and say, hey, if you go, I'll give you a piece of bubble gum. She comes up to Damien's trailer with his grandma there, and the kind old lady asks Damien, will you go to church? I'll give you a piece of bubble gum. And he goes, nah, I'm busy. She goes, well, what do you mean? You're too busy for the Lord? And he goes, Jerry Lawler's on TV today, and I'm not going to miss that to go to church. And he said that his grandma was so embarrassed that she smacked him and told him that he's going to church and told the old lady that he would be there. And so he's like, I missed Jerry that day, and I didn't get a piece of gum.
So one of the things that came up during the Misskelley trial, so they're actually going to be trialed separately.
There's a reason.
Yep. So Jessie Misskelley is going to be tried by himself, and then Damien and Jason are going to be actually tried together. Now, the first trial is going to be the one that actually had the confession on it. Now, up to this point, there is no physical evidence that ties any three of these teens to this crime scene. After they had arrested them, they started to try to kind of fit anything they could, fit in square pegs and round holes. Three of the things they found at the crime scene, they found 2 green threads and 1 red thread that didn't match like the clothing that the kids were wearing.
Let's talk about that during their trial.
Okay, are we talking about the Misskelley trial right now?
We'll go Misskelley first, and then we'll talk about Damien and Jason second.
Okay, yeah, that came in. So those were the only 3 pieces of real actual physical evidence. They had found, the luminol had found blood there, but the blood neither was consistent with the victims, nor was it consistent with the 3 of the teenagers that were charged for this.
Well, goddamn, it's blood in the woods. Blood in the woods could come from an animal. It could come from really anything.
I think they were able to determine, though, that it was human.
Yeah, but again, weird shit happens in the woods.
But they're not going to mention that. That's why it didn't come up until this thing, gets even further up. So during the Misskelley trial, they had numerous witnesses that put Jessie in another county during the time that this could have been committed. They had went to a wrestling event, I think like 20 miles away in another county. They had him signing into like almost a sign-in or a guest book going into this where his signature is showing up. And they also don't they have a picture from that wrestling event?
There's some questions. I went deep because I wanted to see what card they were going to go see that night.
Oh, Jesus.
Wanted to see who was going to wrestle. There's some questions as to when the event actually took place, if it took place on the 5th, the night that it happened, or if it took place after it. Jesse and multiple friends say that it was that night and that Jesse was there and all that stuff was there, but they don't know how to pin down exactly what event that they went to, because there would be like a 3-night event in that town. So it could have been a day later. It could have been a day sooner. It's all very odd, but at the same time, it's a plausible alibi. And everybody kind of has a plausible alibi in this case.
Yeah.
Because he has that. Damien was on the phone with Dominique that night and a couple other friends that his mother confirms he was in his room talking on the phone to them that night. Excuse me. Jason was home with his siblings.
Yeah.
And they both said he was home that night with us. There were different times where people would point out, oh, well, they saw Jason and they saw Damien and they saw Dominique walking along this service road right next to the woods, which would place them at the scene. But the big issue there is if Dominique's there, she was never questioned about this. She was never
And where's Jessie?
implicated. Yeah.
Yeah. And when does Jessie end up coming into this? So they're basing all of the information on the Misskelley trial based on this coerced, admission of guilt. The other thing is this is when they really start leading into the satanic cult aspect of this. And they're doing that because it's going to drum up such outrage, and based on how these guys look, because they all kind of did fit a certain look of being kind of this like troubled youth and kids from the wrong side of the track. And numerous times, why do you think that Damien Echols did this? Well, he just has that look about him that he looks like someone that could do this. So just to provide kind of a little context for how this information from the prosecution side is being gathered and used. The guy that was the medical examiner, his name was Frank Peretti. This guy's a special kind of piece of shit.
Yeah.
He was.
Before we jump into the Misskelley, the reason things were split, and the reason that I believe things were split, and what makes most sense to me, is they knew that they would need the testimony of the confession from Misskelley. So by splitting him away from the case and still keeping Jason and Damien together, once Jessie gets found guilty, they can immediately turn to Jessie and say, hey, you're going away for life now, but if you play ball with us and you testify at Damien and Jason's case, we'll go ahead and give you a substantially less of a sentence. Yep. You'll be out eventually instead of being in there for life. It was basically a bargaining chip for them to split it.
What did he say to that?
Well, that'll come up later, but this is my theory as to why they were doing it.
Well, I know, but we're also moving on to the other case, kind of.
Oh, we still got a lot of the Misskelley case.
Okay. So the medical examiner named Frank Peretti. Now, this guy was the assistant medical examiner. Essentially created the entire drop of like the weapon marks and all this kind of stuff on the body, made his determinations about things. And this guy was not even board certified. He had failed the board certification test twice and refused to take it again. You have 5 attempts to take it to try to pass this. Didn't attempt to take it anymore. And he said, due to personal reasons, I believe is what he wrote down. Now,
he personally couldn't pass the test.
No shit. Now, during this time as well, this isn't where like the medical examiner is an impartial third party that is just putting together this information and then turning it over to both sides for them to do what they need to. The medical examiner essentially is working in no uncertain terms for the side of the prosecution, for the state, basically.
It's debatable whether that's always the case, but yeah.
Especially in this case, it's applicable in this case. Yeah. Now, the information that this guy comes out with to describe like the wounds and everything like that ends up being pretty just almost as wrong as you can be in regards to this. And I guess we can go into a few more details once we get into the other case.
We got to save the turtles.
Okay. You also get a guy that is brought in as an occult expert. I'm not sure if he was used during both trials. I would imagine if they used him during one, they'd use him during the other. His name is Dale Griffiths.
He doesn't come into the second one.
He doesn't come in. I'm just setting the stage with these motherfuckers
then. Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. John Candy is Dale Griffith. Is that his name?
I don't know.
You've never seen Planes, Trains?
I've seen it, but I don't remember.
I think his name's Dale Griffith because he sells the shower rings. But every time they bring him up and reference him, it just feels like a Dale Griffith kind of guy with the stories that he tells and his fake life that he lives.
So Dale Griffith is a graduate of Columbia Pacific University, unaccredited, as an occult expert. So this guy is brought in as the prosecution's expert on all things the occult.
He's a doctor.
Judge, it's Burnett for both of these or just for okay. So Judge David Burnett is presiding over both of these cases. The prosecutor, lead prosecutor on both these cases, I believe, was John Fogelman.
Fucking Fogelman.
This guy is the fucking cunt of all cunts.
Bad guy.
And just during this, they're leaning so hard into this. And I even think at one point during Jessie Misskelley's confession, when they were interrogating him, they showed him pictures of do you know what that would fucking do to your fucking mind? Like, as someone that's not like all mentally there, seeing that kind of shit would just throw you into some type of fucking spiral. You just want to say what you had to say to get out of the fucking room.
Secondary to what else they did. Because what else did they do with the pictures? They had Aaron, Vicky's son, record "Nobody Knows What Happened to Me." And they were playing that.
They were piping in that sound
while
he was ghost child fucking saying that while they were showing it.
Yeah. So
we're being serious about this.
Yeah, this is 100% truth. And it had to have completely broken Jessie to hear that while he's looking at the pictures of this carnage. This trial from the start, Stidham knows that the one thing that he has to attack more than anything is this confession. So from the jump, as soon as the defense gets its chance to argue its case, It attempts to argue that Jesse's confession was inconsistent. It was coerced. Judge Burnett, who is, I believe, the worst person besides Jerry Driver in this whole thing, was just a thorn in Stidham's side the entire time.
I think Fogelman has my top vote for this.
Yeah, Fogelman's also, he's...
grade A shitbird.
Yeah, he might be 1C. I would say Driver 1B, Burnett's 1A, 1B, somewhere in there. But what he would do would be... the professor that you were talking about, Dr. Richard Offshay, the guy that was a professor of sociology at Berkeley, he was brought in because he did a lot of research and worked very hard on looking at police coercion tactics and the way that they would investigate and the way that they would ask questions. What Burnett did, because he didn't like the, we'll call them mental arts, he didn't believe that psychologists had a room in the courtroom. He didn't believe that they should be there. And immediately...
But he's willing to believe unaccredited occultists. He's allowing them in the courtroom as well as non-certified medical examiners.
Yeah, not...
Okay.
He doesn't really...
I just want to know where we stand.
He believes in the heart more than the mind, I think. But Burnett says, okay, we will let Offshay in. Offshay is not allowed to testify at all towards the direction that you believe that the police coerced a false confession and that Jesse's confession is false. He's not allowed to give his opinion on Jesse's innocence or guilt.
Okay, so you're telling me I can have my witness come in and testify, but my witness can't testify to the thing that he's an expert in that applies directly to this case. Got it.
Yeah, and during this whole entire time when Stidham's trying to walk this tightrope of asking Offshay these questions, you have fucking Fogelman objecting to every single question asked, and you have Burnett sustaining every single one of these, essentially the defense that Fogelman is playing. And every single time they have a sidebar, instead of just bringing them up and talking to both lawyers, he's sending the jurors out of the courtroom every single time. And it's just a cycle of him asking a question, Offshay starting to answer it, Fogelman jumping in and objecting immediately, Burnett sustaining it, saying that's not a question that you can ask. There was a point in time when he brought up a medical journal that was, or it wasn't a medical journal, it was a scientific psychological journal. I'm blanking as to where it was.
Goddamn science book out of here,
Yeah.
Dr. Man.
But it was like 350 cases that they've looked at of false confessions where people have confessed to a crime that they actually didn't commit that were proven to be that way. And as he's talking about it, Burnett stops him mid-answer, sends everybody out of the courtroom and says he can't answer that because he's trying to prejudice the jury to put it in their minds that there's a belief that this confession could be false when I've already ruled that it's okay.
That's the whole fucking point, dude.
Yeah.
That's a big part of this case is how the fucking confession came about.
And you might wonder how this is all possible, how it's all legal. I'm not a professional in any of this stuff. I've just done a lot of research. That's a scary sentence to say when you're about to start making some proclamations. But it's not necessarily that it has to be legal, because when you're in a court of law and there's a trial going on, whatever the judge says goes. So you're playing by his playbook.
It's a court of his law.
Yes.
Is what it is. It's like fucking playing house rules in beer pong.
Yeah, and if he were to be questioned on something and they were to file an appeal based upon something that he did, if he was too prejudicial, that'll go to the Supreme Court or it'll go to a higher court. They'll then rule on it, whether it was something wrong that he did or if they were allowed to do that in the court. So essentially, they're just playing by Burnett's rules this entire time, and he is doing whatever he can to make sure. It's so hard to say that a judge is doing whatever they can to make sure that there's a guilty verdict rendered, but that's pretty much all that's going on this entire time.
This entire, both of the cases have a distinct aura of advancement of their careers to it when you kind of get down to the nitty and gritty.
But yeah, there was a guy named Warren Holmes that was a polygraph expert that came in to talk about the relevancy of the polygraph and about how that could be used as a tool for the police to investigate further, even though they weren't giving any sort of reasoning behind it. Well, Burnett says he can't testify because lie detectors aren't admissible in court. but that's what they use to get Damien.
Yeah, but they want to use that point during. They want to bring up that point. It's whatever serves to support it's whatever serves to support their narrative in that. Eventually, on February 5th, Misskelley is convicted of 1 count of first-degree murder, 2 counts of second-degree murder, life, plus 40 years.
Yeah, he was convicted of the first-degree count because I believe that it was Michael. During this rambling, coerced confession, during this bad confession, he admits that Michael tried to run away and he held Michael down until...
And, like, brought him back or something like that.
Until the boys came to get him.
So, with that happening, now that that's out of the way, now they can offer the deal of saying, hey, now that we've got you, we can try to make things a little bit easier on you if you want to go ahead and testify against Damien and Jason in their trial. And at that point, Jessie is like, you know what? My mother taught me that I shouldn't lie, and being given some time to actually get my thoughts together and think about this and not be in a room where you're fucking piping in ghost kid noises and showing me pictures, I'm not going to lie anymore. And I refuse to testify. So February 19th rolls around. We get Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin, their trial beginning without the expected testimony of Jessie from the prosecution side. All right, well, I wish we could say that the trial that takes place for Damien and Jason is better, but it definitely is not. In fact, it goes down even fucking further.
They have to get more creative because, again, the day before the trial, Jessie gets back to the prosecution and he says, I'm not going to testify. Mm-hmm. So they have to do an about face and figure out what they have now. And what they have, I'll give it to them. They're fucked. They're assholes. They did a terrible thing. But my God, did they get creative.
It's not even really clever when you look back on it, though. But it was enough to try to drum up enough outrage that the jury was like, well, obviously this has to be driven by... They lean so far into, like, the satanic portion of this. It's fucking bonkers. It seems like it's made for fucking TV.
Yeah. So one of the... we're just going to hit the highlights because they're all just incredible, and this is going to kind of lay out exactly...
Low lights is probably...
Okay. It's incredible how far they went with a lot of these things, but Chris mentioned Frank Peretti earlier, the medical examiner that wasn't a board-certified medical examiner.
Medical examining enthusiast, I guess, is what's more appropriate.
He got paid to cut people open illegally.
And make wrong determinations about what probably killed them.
So, November 19th, we're hitting rewind, they decide to search the pond that was behind Damien's family trailer. Now,
Jason's.
Damien's.
I'm pretty sure it was Jason's. It was Jason's knife.
Damien's knife.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure it was. So regardless, we'll get that figured out here in a second. But I would bet you a pretty fair amount of money that if you went to anybody's body of water within inside a trailer park, you could dredge any of those ponds inside there, and I bet you'd come up with a knife every single time.
Well, it's not even just that type of generalization. The knife that was in question was like a combat knife, like what you would see like in Vietnam, like serrated on one side and then a blade on the other.
Yeah, so you can saw through wood or anything like that.
Yeah, a survival knife, whatever they want to call it. That had been thrown back there a year previously.
Yeah. I know that it had been thrown back there previously. The only thing I would say that a year seems a little off is they were questioning, I believed it was Damien's, it could have been Jason's, but I believe it was Damien's mom, and they hadn't moved back to Arkansas yet. So that would be kind of my one, and if I'm wrong about that, I'm definitely wrong about it. But either way, with this combat knife that they had found, Frank Peretti had testified that there were scratch marks along the bodies that were...
The knife was found in a search behind Jason Baldwin's home.
Okay. So yeah, if it was Jason's, then it would stand
because his mother
reason.
even came out and said, like, no, that's his knife. I threw it in there. I took it away from him and threw it in there like a year ago. But what was crazy about it is I believe that during questioning and everything like that, there probably was something that came up. And it makes sense when I connect this, and it's very in my mind, very simple to get to. They're questioning his parents. They have him brought in, and they're saying, well, there were stab knives. We need to check for, like, did your kid have any weapons or anything like that? And she's like, no. In fact, he had a knife a year ago, and I took it away from him, and I threw it in the pond. And he's like, oh, you threw it? And she's like, yeah, I took it out back, and I threw it out there. Because the fucking prosecutor, fucking Fogelman, hires a fucking diver to go out there to look for a fucking knife and calls the fucking press and calls them to show up and say, hey, we're going to find something here, and tells him where to search in like a 30-foot area within a half an hour of in a muddy fucking pond behind a trailer park where there is bound to be so much shit back there. He ends up theatrically surfacing holding this knife, and all the reporters are there, and Fogelman's there, and everyone's like, oh. So he basically fucking sets this thing up to find this knife, and now all of a sudden they have the weapon that was used. When in actuality, come to find out, during the trial, the medical examiner, this fucktard, is showing that the scratches that were on the kids' bodies were done by dragging the serrated portion across their backs. Okay, first of all, is that a kind of torture or anything like that you're dragging?
First of all, what are you doing taking your son's knife, and instead of getting rid of it in a normal way, you just walk out back and you huck it in the pond?
Adam,
I'm just saying.
You're in a West Memphis fucking trailer park, dude. I'm not trying to generalize. What I'm saying, if there's a fucking fight and the mom's pissed off and she's like, you don't need a fucking knife, the most, the thing she can do to drive her point home is chucking it in the fucking pond behind the house.
It's just a wild way to dispose of a weapon.
Okay, but it still has to get there somehow.
No. I'm not saying that that's wrong or anything like that. I'm just saying.
I think it's a pretty normal way to dispose of a weapon, actually.
Yeah, let's just use a little bit more common sense when we're taking our children's weapons away.
Okay. At this point, do you want to talk about what it actually is?
No, not yet.
Okay.
Because as Peretti's testifying to these scrape marks, he's testifying that the stab wounds are consistent with the backside of the wound looking like it was drug along the serrated edge. So on cross, I forgot to write down Damien's lawyers' names. I'm sorry, guys. You're good people. But
I'll get them.
During cross-examination, as they're asking Peretti, they say, are the scratch marks and wounds consistent with this type of knife? And he goes, well, yeah. And they go, is it specific to just this knife, or is it anything that has a serrated back on it?
Steve Braga and Patrick Benka.
Were those the ones that came in later?
Braga and Benka negotiated. Oh, they negotiated for the Alford plea.
So his second ones, we needed his first ones.
Okay.
I think it was just one. I think he just had one guy, because he talks about in the book that he never sees him. And to back up, just a fuzz, because there's two things that I want to just really harp on here, and I needed to do it for most of this episode. One, the most important thing that you need in a situation like this for these murders is a motive. And there's no motive for Damien, Jason, or Jessie to commit these crimes and to kill these kids, because they didn't really know them. They knew of them, but there was no motive that they had that these murders were to happen. The second one is all of these guys' lawyers screwed up, because the first thing they should have done is petition for a change of venue. Can you imagine how much different these trials would have gone if they had petitioned for a change of venue and they took it to somewhere else in Arkansas and got a different draw from a different judge and had a different pool of jurors to pick from that maybe weren't as familiar with this case that happened in this town?
They do that now to prevent this very type of thing from happening.
Yeah, cases nowadays do that all the time. So I don't know if this wasn't a train of legal thought back then, but the jury pool was tainted from the jump because of all this information that got out to the press and to the media, that they spread it out everywhere.
Was it Ed Mallett?
It sounds right.
I'll keep looking.
Okay. I mean, I don't know if you'll be able to find it.
Okay, so here's what it showed me. During that whole trial, it was Val Price, Scott Davidson, and Daniel Stidham between the three teens.
Okay. So it would have been Val Price or the other guy, not Stidham, because Stidham was Jessie.
Yeah.
But getting back to Peretti. So they ask him, are the wounds consistent with just this knife, or could it be any combat style knife? And Peretti's like, well, it could be any combat style knife. So he goes, in other words, this might not be the murder weapon, right? And he's like, well, yeah, no, the wounds could have come from any combat style knife that had a serrated edge on it. So immediately this knife that was pulled out of the lake like the goddamn sword in the stone that is the murder weapon is immediately called into question, because it's not just specific to that knife. It's any knife that has a serrated back on it.
Those knives are like you can get those at like an Army Navy store, just like in fucking boxes.
Dime a dozen. Yeah, you can get them out of Bud K catalogs. You can get them
flea
anywhere.
markets and everything.
Yes. Yeah. So to me, that feels like it's got to be a win for the defense. There's this lady named Lisa Sakavicius, who is a state crime lab tester. She comes and she testifies to these polyester fibers that are microscopically similar that were found at the crime scene on the boys' bodies to fibers that were found on a shirt of Damien's at his house, and then a bathrobe that's at Jesse's house.
I don't even think it was one of Damien's shirts. I think it was a red thread from one of his sister's shirts.
That was found in his trailer?
That was found in his trailer. And then, yeah, a bathrobe that was, again, similar. It doesn't have to be that. It just happened to have been a similar fiber. It could have belonged to the fiber that was made in how many other countless shirts that were bought from the same area if they were all shopping at the same place.
Oh, yeah. And then again on cross, just like Peretti's failures, when the defense attorney gets up and is speaking to her, he goes, well, how similar are these? And she goes, they're microscopically similar. And he goes, just specifically to these threads, or most threads microscopically similar to each other? And Lisa goes, well, all threads are kind of microscopically similar to each other. There's plenty of these materials out there.
So you just happen to mean this is red cotton.
Exactly.
As opposed to red polyester, as opposed to red lycra or something like that.
Yeah, so literally any other red polyester shirt, would those fibers be microscopically similar to the ones that you found? And that answer is yes. So again, these two first experts that come up to testify are immediately shot down on cross because the evidence just is not there.
Well, now comes the heavy hitter.
Yeah, they don't have the testimony. So yeah, heavy hitter, Dale Griffith, whatever you want to call him at this point, is an occult expert that testifies to the satanic ritualism of the murders. This guy went to what Chris was talking about, a generally unaccredited, now completely defunct university called Columbia Pacific University, where he got his
over the phone, wasn't it?
Through the mail.
Okay, that's right.
Through the mail, he gets this doctorate. And while he's up there and they're doing what's called a voir dire, which is where they question an expert to see if he's up to snuff, the defense gets up and says, Columbia University. And this feels so much like Saving Silverman to me when Jack Black is talking to Judith.
Yeah.
And she's like, Ivy League, more or less.
Yeah. Stanford University?
SU?
Subway University.
Stanford University. Subway University. Yeah. I have a friend that went there, J.D. McNugent.
Nope,
do you know
never
him?
heard of such person.
This was a lot like that because the defense attorney goes, Columbia Pacific, is that something that you attended classes for? How many classes did you attend to achieve that doctorate that you got? And they have to ask this question to him 6 times before he finally answers and says, I never attended a class. They sent this to me in the mail. And I guess they must have really done their research because from what I heard, the defense attorney holds up an envelope and says, did your
degree?
Yeah, did your degree come in an envelope like this? He's like, yeah. Not recently, I think it was in the 2000s, they were actually shut down because this is all it was just a pay to play to get your degree. And so completely wiped off the map. The unfortunate part of this is when they go to get him kicked off the stand and basically denied to come up and be a guest.
Basically try to scratch his testimony because he's a charlatan.
Yeah. Judge Burnett says, you don't have to have that piece of paper to be an expert. You can just live. This guy is an expert on the occult. How many times do you hear the word occult in daily life? What life experiences are you going to have to be an expert in the occult?
Mm-hmm.
What in the hell does that even mean?
Like I said, man, it's the trial is already, they've set themselves up to where this thing, regardless of what they do, is going to be a fucking slam dunk. And just to make sure that this thing is tied up neatly with a bow, they bring out the most damning evidence of all. Music, the journals, 15 black shirts.
Jason owned 15 black shirts.
Oh my God. Clutching my pearls. He had some animal skulls by his nightstand. Kind of fucking weird, but, you know, there's other levels of weird were used as evidence. And his statements regarding those original ones where he was talking about the genital mutilation when they were interrogating him initially about the crime and what he knew about it.
So
this motherfucker.
Yeah, I would say maybe their star witness or maybe the one that made the most impact. Oh, yeah, by the way, Vicky testified in both of these trials. She lied her ass off on the stand the entire time through both of these times. They were going to run, bless you, they were going to run Aaron up there on the stand to give his testimony about what he knew, Vicky's 8-year-old son. But they decided to scrap it because he just kept telling crazier and crazier stories.
Yeah, the story never, it just kept escalating. It was never the same story, so they had no idea what this kid would fucking say.
It got to the point, I think, to where Aaron told him a story one time that a black guy held a gun to his head as he actually dismembered one of the boys himself.
Yeah, exactly.
This kid's 8 years old.
And
where do you come up with that?
And just so you know, Vicky actually did not have any theft charges brought against her, which is very kind of suspect and everything considering all that she contributed to this. But this guy that they pull up on the stand, his name is Michael Carson, and he was 16 years old, I believe, at the time. He was someone that had been sharing a cell with Jason Baldwin and had basically had, I think, like drug charges against him and everything.
Like the acid.
Like the acid.
At 16 years old.
Mm-hmm. Gonna do some shit to your brain. Yeah. Basically came up and was like, hey, I have some information. Because I'm sure at some point when they're trying to gather information, they're going to talk to the cellmate and be like, hey, did he ever tell you anything? He's like, you know, if he did tell you something, it could go far in trying to go and reduce your sentence. And he's like, guess what? As a matter of fact, he told me some pretty fucked up shit. Yeah. So they call this 16-year-old fucking person that has been arrested in the system for acid to the stand to actually testify. And as he's testifying, just fucking the most outrageous shit. He's like, yeah, Jason told me that they had chopped off the penis, they had drank blood from the penis, and they had put his balls in his mouth.
Jason sucked the blood out of the boy's penis.
Yes.
And then put the balls in his mouth.
And this is one of those situations where you got to laugh or you're going to fucking cry because this actually fucking happened in a court of law. And the jury is just like, oh, dear me. And I'm sure someone stand up and was like, this is the devil's work. And some lady in the back fucking faints.
Clutching her pearls.
The combination of all of this bullshit testimony and I'm doing quotes here, evidence, ends up leading exactly what you think it's going to lead to. Echols and Baldwin are convicted on 3 counts of murder on March 18th. After, you're being gracious, their 1 day of deliberation, I think it equated to what, like 7 to 9 hours?
4 hours for the deliberation. They had to make it a day because it was into the night long enough. They only had to deliberate for 4 hours. For the deliberations for the conviction, and I believe it was like 2 hours and 20 minutes. 2 hours-ish, maybe somewhere around there.
Also, during this trial, one thing that happened that's like a big fucking no-no when it comes to these types of things is there were, I don't know if it was multiple, but there was at least one meeting between the judge and the prosecution regarding this trial. You can't fucking meet to discuss details of the trial and everything without having both the defense and the fucking prosecution there. So they were essentially backroom dealing and discussing this case to get on fucking the same page without the defense there. So they were fucking working this thing from behind the scenes as well.
And just to tie up this final Michael Carson testimony, the reason that this all came out and the reason that he would eventually recant is because the detention center that Michael Carson and Jason were both held at actually played the trial and they played his testimony. And as they were watching it on the screen, all of the kids in the detention center were going crazy. They were screaming about how Michael was lying. They were saying that Jason never said that or admitted that.
The officers in the detention center, there was a lady that did that interview on West of Memphis, and she's like, he's lying. You know that, right? And even the head of the detention center came up and he's like, it's their job to make the messes. They're making this mess. We have to try to clean up their mess. And that's basically his way of saying we have no control over this. We just have to handle these kids when they get into the system or what's happening right now.
And one of the guards even comes out and says, I was the one that said this. He didn't hear this from Jason. This was a rumor that I had heard from another guard that I was talking about with somebody else, that he must have overheard the details and he ran with that story. So this wasn't even a firsthand account. This was just Michael Carson looking for a way to lessen his sentence by finding out some juicy lies that the guards were spreading amongst themselves.
Yeah.
Just absolute madness how this stuff comes through.
So, go ahead.
To go along with that, after the sentencing happens, Damien is sentenced to death. Jason is sentenced to life in prison. Now, I would say this seems odd, but Jason got probably the rawest deal out of all three. I know we spent a long time on Damien, but Jason being tied in the exact same trial as Damien, all of this is going on, all of this shade that they're throwing towards Damien and all of this occult talk and that he's a satanic leader.
They're using all the evidence against, aside from the knife, which they're using to then tie Jason into it. Everything they're using as far as this like character type shit to paint him as he looks like the kind of person who could do it. By association, that means that Jason was involved because he's a friend of this person. He's an associate of this person.
And they're both on trial together.
Yeah.
So any of this evidence points to both of them instead of just one of them. So Damien ends up getting a death sentence. Jason gets life. I'm assuming because somehow the court says, or the jury saw it, was like, well, we heard Jason's name maybe 10 times, whereas we heard Damien's name maybe 50 times. That's the only delineation I could figure out between a death sentence for Damien and life for Jason. Before the trial had happened and after Jessie had said no, the prosecution actually went to Jason and said, hey, if you testify against Damien, we'll make sure to reduce your sentence because we need to make sure that he's guilty and he's put away for life. We can also protect you. Their first deal was 40 years, and he immediately said no. The second deal they came back with was 10 years.
Yeah.
So if you are going to prosecute this kid as a triple murder suspect and you want to find him guilty, if you believe that he was atrocious enough to commit 3 murders, you're going to let him go after 10 years?
That's what you're saying. You're basically saying we're completely positive that you did this, but we're willing to let a convicted murderer only serve 10 years and then be out.
Just absolutely wild. That's a thought process.
It's such bullshit. Now, after this happens, I'm not exactly familiar on the time frame of when this comes. Like, this is definitely something that's going to come to national attention just based upon the whole satanic panic aspect of it and everything. But this draws the attention of quite a few people that are like, there is something that does not, sound right about this whole thing and how it went down. So this case...
We got some time for this one.
So this case starts to draw attention. What were the initial documentaries that were made, the 3-part one?
Paradise Lost was actually the first Paradise Lost. There were 3 of them that were filmed. The first Paradise Lost was filmed during the first trial. And basically the 2 guys, or the 2 directors are on that one. What's was it for Paradise Lost?
Yeah, was it the first one of the first trials to have cameras in the courtroom?
Yeah, I mean, OJ was kind of right around there too. This was right around kind of the beginning of it.
Bruce Sinofsky and Joe Berlinger
they were reporters, I believe, from New York, and they got wind of this case. They're like, well, shit, this would make for a pretty good documentary. We'll go down and document these 3 satanic boys.
Yeah, they went down there with the intention of basically just confirming and doing like a story on like the satanic aspect and everything, with the already believing that these guys were guilty. They were just covering it. And as soon as they fucking got down there and started even digging into it, they didn't have to dig deep. It's like that first initial shovel through hard soil where you're picking up just like a little bit. And it was like, oh, Oh, no.
So the lady who wrote Devil's Knot, Mara
Leverett. Leverett.
I listened to an interview with Mara Leverett, and she wrote this incredible book called Devil's Knot. I say incredible because I didn't read it, but I listened to a few interviews from her, and she seems like a pretty straightforward gal.
Sure.
She said that...
Hey, Oprah makes bad book endorsements, apparently, too. If it's a bad book,
No. She's great.
Okay.
Mara's great. She said that when the producers for Paradise Lost came down there, they wanted to film inside the courtroom and they wanted to run their audio. Well, people in charge of the Arkansas courthouse were like, yeah, our audio system is archaic. It's not very good, so I don't think we can do it. And the two guys were like, well, we'll pay for this courtroom to be completely rewired and all these new mics and everything to be put in. And the people running the courthouse are like, we don't have to pay for it? They're like, no. So like, okay. So these two guys actually got the courthouse completely up to date for all the audio recordings for Paradise Lost. So that was how far they were willing to go to get this story, was they rewired and remiked a courtroom in Arkansas.
And again, that's just them getting a story about these three guys who they believed actually did this.
Yeah. And then over time, as they looked at the evidence themselves, they realized that this story was just absolutely insane.
Do you think that they're sitting there while they're doing this coverage on it and they're watching this case unfold? And as it's unfolding, they're just looking at each other being like, that this isn't real, right?
I would assume as soon as they heard the first confession, as soon as they heard Jesse's confession, they knew that there was something wrong.
Yeah.
That and just the lack of evidence that they had, because there was nothing. And again, there's no motive. There's no reason that this was that this was going to happen. And the only motive that you can go on is this is a satanic cult that was trying to get rid of the three kids. Forgot to mention, during Dale Griffith's occult expert testimony, he was asked by the prosecution if 8 is a witch's number. And he said that 8 was a witch's number based upon some writings of Aleister Crowley.
It was, there was a wording in there that it was less than 8.
Yes.
Or sorry, 8 and something, but the number in the case didn't match up to the number 8. And so he's like, well, it can actually be 9.
Yeah. It was 8 and... It was like under 8,
you
would lose your
8,
magical powers or something like that, but at 9 you would. Also, again, there's so much shit to this case that we aren't even covering all of the crazy
It is literally
evidence.
Salem witch trials level shit that's taking place in 1994 here.
But just to go back for the worst reasons possible, during Jesse's confession, he mentions on multiple occasions that Damien and Jason were screwing these boys, so that they were raping these kids. And after the first trial comes out, they looked at all of the ME's reports and said that there was no trauma to the anus of these boys.
Yeah, there was no evidence to suggest that anything sexual had happened.
They couldn't prove sexual assault. So before Damien and Jason's trial, their defense attorney said, hey, you guys are going to try to bias the jury by bringing up this sexual assault. You're not allowed to, because everything in these medical reports says that these boys weren't sexually assaulted. There's no factual
evidence that supports any of that claim.
And the judge goes ahead and says, no, they can bring it up if they want to. And
it's your job to disprove it.
Yeah. So how do you disprove something that there's no proof of happening?
When the medical examiner is the one that's actually working for the prosecution.
Yeah, and Judge Burnett allows this to happen, and of course they use it to bias the jury, because 3 8-year-olds not only being murdered but being sexually assaulted at the same time just plays to their emotions so much more. So again, we'll fast forward back to Paradise Lost and all these documentaries that were made about them. We'll hit a little bit more of a fast forward to November 4th, 2010. The Arkansas... Oh, shit. God damn it. Back to Dell. This whole number 8 defense that they used was actually, again, confirmed by the Arkansas Supreme Court for stopping a new trial for them.
Yeah, they were confirming its validity about something about being
8 being a witch's number.
Yeah.
They confirmed the validity that 8 was a witch's number in the Arkansas Supreme Court.
Yeah.
How is that possible?
I I know, man. So these documentaries end up drawing up this huge support and this huge movement that's basically like free the West Memphis Three. These guys have spent enough time in there. The evidence, looking back on it, even during the court, the trial was a fucking sham. And so, like Adam was saying, November 2010 rolls around. The Arkansas Supreme Court orders Judge Burnett, who, because he presided over the original case and was still an acting judge, it has to go back to him, which is fucking bonkers that's how it works.
Mara Leverett said every day she prayed that the judge would get a different position or he would retire. So
he was running for Senate or something like that, or thinking about running for Senate. And so when he was campaigning for Senate, they weren't wishing this guy would lose. They were like, we will do whatever we can to support this guy to get him the votes, because once he was out of that position, a new judge could actually get in front of it. Yeah. So it was sent in front of Judge Burnett to determine whether new DNA evidence not linked to either of the three Echols, Baldwin, or Misskelley would be admissible, and also a claim of juror misconduct, basically on the jury foreman, Kent Arnold. Now, what did Kent Arnold do?
Kent Arnold, after he was chosen to be a jury foreman, went and talked to his own lawyer about the case. And that's a big no-no, because you're not supposed to discuss the case with anybody else, and you discussed it with a lawyer. And after that, when they went in for deliberations, all of the other jurors agreed that basically Kent Arnold was doing everything that he could to secure a guilty verdict in the jury box. Trying to bring up stuff that they didn't even know about, that Kent Arnold had read in the papers and had known about, saying, well, they didn't tell you this. This was also found. All this other bullshit that was lies, he was bringing into the juror's room.
Yep. So they were trying to justify this new trial or an exoneration of the at this point, the three men that are still behind bars. Thankfully, Burnett was elected to the state Senate, and a new judge, David Lasser, was actually selected to preside over a new evidentiary hearing after a successful appeal. Now, this evidence that they were bringing to the table, we kind of have to talk about the DNA evidence and everything.
We'll get to that. That's that one.
Okay.
Every time I wrote down that name, I was thinking his last name was Laser. But as soon as you said Lasser, it makes so much more sense.
Yeah. So it doesn't take, in the span of like how long this thing has actually already gone on, it's not long before on August 19th, 2011, basically based upon this new evidence, and we're going to talk about that when we talk about who we believe actually did this. A new deal is actually struck where all three are actually released after what's called an Alfred plea.
Yes.
Where it wasn't at trial yet. So basically this is still just kind of in that deliberation phase where the defense is showing the prosecution what they have and a decision is trying to be made when they're discussing a plea. At this point, based on this new evidence that we're going to discuss here in a second, the attorney general looks at this and is basically like, yeah. And can't basically admit, but if you're watching him on this document, Jesus Christ, why can't I think of
documentary?
The word? Documentary.
West of Memphis, is that the one?
He's basically indicating that they had, and that's what an Alfred plea is. They're basically stating, hey, we're going to go ahead and set you free, but just so you know, we had enough evidence to convict you and to make this decision. So, of course, these guys get this deal put in front of him. Damien signs it right away. Jason signs it right away. And it goes to the third person, which is Jessie. And Jessie, because it's all three or none of them, Jessie kind of holds their fate in his hands. And at this point, Jesse's now of the mind that he's like, I was fucking tricked into this whole thing. I was fucking coerced into not only ruining my life, but also my best friend, Damien, and this other guy.
Jason. Jason was the one that was the last one. He was the holdout because he believed he was truly innocent.
I thought it was Jessie.
Jason said that he only signed it, I think, because he knew how bad Damien's position was being on death row.
Okay.
And that could be wrong, too. You got me 1-0 on that first one on the knife. If you can go 2-0, I got to retire from true crime.
I don't want you to retire.
But to suss out what an Alfred plea is while he looks that up.
It says Jessie Misskelley is considered to have signed it last.
God damn it.
And the reason he wanted to sign it last is I think he felt like he had been put into this situation where they were even considered guilty based on that coercion and that admission. And when they first told him the Alfred deal and they were talking to him about it, he's like, but that still means that we're not technically exonerated and that we're admitting they had enough to show us as guilty. He's like, I don't want to carry that around. And after discussion of it, he understood what that would also be doing to both Damien and Jason. And so there's footage of them in court when they're talking about accepting this deal. He stands up, he declares his innocence. I did not do this, but it's in my best interest, in the interest of these other two, that I accept this plea deal. And so all three of them accept the Alfred pleas and basically are sentenced to time served and are released.
But what an Alfred plea is you are able to publicly maintain your innocence, but at the same time, you are acknowledging that they have enough evidence to find you guilty.
You're basically saying, hey, we're innocent, but yeah, you did have enough evidence to convict us. So what you guys were doing, you guys made the right decision, as much so as we can't come back and now present a civil suit against you.
Yep.
Because had it gone to trial with the evidence that they had, it would have opened up the state of Arkansas for an enormous fucking settlement in a civil suit.
So currently, Jason, Jessie, and Damien, all three are still guilty and have been convicted of these triple murders. So that's still on their record. Their records are not clear at all. They're just released based upon the time served, the agreed upon plea deal. So they're still all of their records still show that they're convicted murderers. And I understand that at least freedom is more than anything. Freedom's the most important thing. But at the same time, if you're a free man and anytime you go in to try to get a new job or anytime anybody looks you up and sees that you're a convicted murderer, from then on, you're branded.
But you still have the opportunity to go in and get that job that you would not have. If, based on the time that they were in there, nothing could have, like, had that been me, nothing could have kept me away from getting out of that place.
No. At the same time, once you're out, though, you have to continue that fight to clear your name.
I know, but at the same time, like, imagine if you were in prison for fucking 18 years. You would do anything. I don't think at that point, your pride, I think something overrules that just fucking fight for freedom has to overrule that sense of like wanting to keep your pride.
Your fight can't end, though, by being set free. Once you're set free, what's your next goal?
Worry about that when you're fucking free, dude. Well, that needs to be a free man's concern.
And I think they have. Nowadays, I believe it's Jessie has an Innocence Project, or Jason has an Innocence Project. That's right. Jason has an Innocence Project where he's got people that have invested in the Innocence Project. There's lawyers that work pro bono for them. They go through and look at these cases that are presented of false confessions or anything like that. And he actually still works to this day to try to free people that he believes have been incarcerated falsely.
This isn't as uncommon. Like, this one stands out, but things like this are not uncommon at all.
No, not in the slightest. But
so
we have to figure this out.
Yeah. So who done it?
I believe we are the top podcast at figuring this out because we're going to give you the same conclusion that pretty much everybody's come to at this point.
And because it has to be the correct conclusion.
Yeah. But we'll start out with Christopher Byers' father.
John Mark Byers.
So some of the strikes against him were after the trial had concluded. Byers had a knife that looked to have maybe some DNA on it, and he had turned it over to, I believe it was the Paradise Lost producers, and they had it tested. When it came back, there was DNA both found from John and from Christopher. Now, you'd say that's not too odd, but John was Christopher's stepfather. And stepkids and stepfathers don't have biologically similar or DNA similar blood because they didn't come from one another. So that's a little bit of a questionable thing. Christopher was the only victim that was mutilated. And again, fuck it. We'll talk about it now. The mutilations on the bodies were something that was pretty hotly contested because Peretti had said that all of these wounds were inflicted on these kids by the murderer.
All right, here we go. I've been waiting for this. Okay. So one of the biggest aspects of being able to convince people of this cult activity was the state of the bodies that they were in. Once a lot of people ended up getting wind of this, and a lot of the people that ended up leading to the release of these guys with the support and everything involved the hiring of a ton of these fucking experts in all these different fields. Peter Jackson is doing a little bit of an interview on West of Memphis, and he's talking about, he's like, why just get one of the best guys? He's like, we went out and got like 6 or 7 of the best experts in these fields to look into this, gave them all of the evidence. They had guys that were FBI serial killer, murder profilers, all of this shit. They went to everybody to examine every piece of evidence, not just like, here, one person examine all the evidence. It's, you're an expert in this field. Here's your evidence to examine. This is yours. You examine this. All of the mutilation that had occurred was determined to have been caused by animals. And when looking at the location that they were in and talking to anybody around that area, they're like, oh yeah, we called that place Turtle City back there. And not just your little soft shell swimming around in the water type turtles. These are fucking Arkansas type turtles. You got the big old fucking snapping turtles. Turtles, when you see them feed, they're not just like going, and eating fucking lettuce like a tortoise. Turtles will eat dead things.
Yeah.
And the determination is that when turtles going through, how they feed and everything, they go after the softer bits. They go after like hanging parts.
Say a penis,
ears. They even did studies where they would get a snapping turtle. They would have it bite onto either somebody's arm, like a pig.
Craziest thing
that.
I've ever seen.
And what they did is the guy shows, he goes, that's the turtle mark. As soon as it bites him, it then shows a side by side with the pictures and showing the triangular jawline and everything. All of these bite marks on these bodies are the shape of fucking turtle bites from these things. The scratches, they were showing when these things are feeding, how they put their, front legs against it to get grip and everything, and how they can leave scratch. They were showing against like wood, and it would scratch into wood. Because the marks were sometimes they said that the serrated blade caused it. They were kind of inconsistent in their spacing apart. They were fucking turtle scratch marks from this. So the entire angle that they were saying was the mutilation that was the cause of the satanic ritual, which in turn is what Damien was doing. It all turns out that was done after the bodies were already there. Not only that, but they were looking at the wounds on the bodies and they were like, yeah, these are post-mortem wounds. Like these weren't even done while they were alive because there's no blood pooling. And had they been done while they were alive, that luminol would have went off the fucking charts. Yeah. That's why it didn't, is because the bodies weren't fucking bleeding at that location. They had people going over the fucking testimony again of all the inconsistencies. What also came to light during this time is 2 of the witnesses that they called that were 2 of the biggest testimonies in the trial were Vicky Hutchinson and it was Michael Carson. Vicky Hutchinson ends up coming in and they end up calling Stidham. And this is again, years later, Stidham gets this call. He was the attorney that represented Jessie. Gets this call. There's another lawyer on the line. She's like, I have this woman, Vicky Hutchinson, here in my office wanting to talk about this testimony that she provided during the Memphis 3 case. I think you need to get down here. And as they go down and talk to her, she's like, it was all fucking lies. I didn't go with them. Anything. She's like, I was drinking a lot at that time. I remember that night I drank like a bottle of fucking, was it wild turkey?
Yep.
Wild turkey. I'd had one that morning and then I'd had one that evening. She's like, I woke up in my yard with an empty bottle of wild turkey. She's like, I had no recollection of anything that happened. So that testimony about her going with them to that fucking pagan or Wiccan festival was complete and utter bullshit out of her, straight from her mouth.
All fueled by Arkansas apple juice.
Yep. Michael Carson ends up coming out and is like, yeah, that information, that testimony that I gave, that never happened. I never heard any of that from Jessie. So those 2 things that were so crucial in getting that jury to convict these guys ends up coming straight from the mouths of the people that gave the testimony to be complete bullshit.
Yeah. And just to keep pushing this Byers thought process, Byers had quite a record on him. He was convicted of terroristic threats after he threatened to kill his first wife. He was put on probation for this. Two of the terms of his probation was that he was supposed to find steady work and he was supposed to pay his child support now because his wife had divorced him previously and he had actually come back to attack her that night. He did neither one of these things. He didn't maintain any consistent work and he never paid his child support. His probation was fulfilled and then signed off by a little-known judge named Judge Burnett. Pretty weird how that happens.
Yep.
He was also arrested on a narcotics charge, and he actually flipped and became an informant for the narcotics unit. He had some pretty weird things that went on. I believe also, like later on down the road, like 2004-ish, Byers' wife, Michael's mother, actually dies under Christopher's mother dies under some kind of questionable circumstances. Mm-hmm. And while he's being questioned about it, he says that he didn't suffocate her, but he was worried that they were going to try to find.
And he's giving this statement with his girlfriend, right, at the time?
I think so, yeah.
He was giving the statement, and he said he had been sleeping next to not his girlfriend, but his ex-wife at the time, and they had been doing drugs, and that, like, she had just, like, stopped breathing or some shit. It's super fucking suspect any way you fucking slice it.
Yeah.
He was questioned actually quite a bit, probably the most outside of the main three that were convicted of it. But again, it ends up falling on those three guys.
He also passed a polygraph test, which you would think would be a strike in his favor.
So he's a shithead, but he's not a murdering shithead.
Well, he passed it, but also they determined that he was...
We can say in our opinion, because we both have the same opinion of who it was, yes, he's a suspect, but he's not a murdering shithead suspect.
No. When he did his lie detector test, though, they said that he was under the heavy influence of drugs.
Yes.
Which will definitely affect something that tests your heartbeat and your rhythms and all that stuff. But I would say the number one reason that you have to cross Byers off the list is throughout the entire time, throughout the case, throughout after the case, everything like that, Byers is pointing the finger at the three boys saying, you guys did this, you need to rot in hell, you need to stay away for the rest of your life. Now, if you had committed a murder, you would immediately think, okay, well, they have convictions, I have to keep condemning them and blaming them, right? Mm-hmm. After he saw all the new evidence, he actually came out and said, I believe that these boys are innocent.
That was kind of a common thing that happened during the time, and I get distraught parents. I can understand that from a parent's perspective, is you just want to try to see justice served. You're blinded by this fucking sadness and this rage. You give a direction, they point you in a direction, they say this is who did that, and you just are directing all your rage and pain at them. After all of this new evidence comes to light and this stuff kind of like trickles out, all of a sudden you start to see these parents start to be like, fuck, I don't think it was these guys.
Well, and if it was Byers, why would Byers be advocating for them to get out and advocating for their innocence? Yep. It doesn't make any sense to blame somebody for a crime that you committed and then come out and say, actually, they were innocent. We need to find the real killers.
I understand that, but too little, too late from this guy.
I mean, if you were truly guilty of it, would you be doing that?
Yeah, I understand that. Could it have been the Bojangles man? Blood samples ended up being fucking lost. Like the guy that was in charge of the blood scrapings, they're like, what happened to those when he was being, I think, what do they call it when you're questioned? Mm-hmm. And he's like, oh yeah, I lost those.
Not only that, the Bojangles was around a mile away from the woods, so not a very long walk. When they were pulling the kids out, they wrapped them up in blankets to then carry them to the coroner's van. And on one of the sheets that they had wrapped them in, they actually found an African-American hair that was on one of the bodies that was then transferred to one of the sheets while they were carrying them. Whether that was on the ground or anything like that.
Whether that could have been on the sheet initially.
Yes,
or something like
up to
that.
interpretation. But it is interesting that they could have had the blood samples to try to match up with the scene to see if it matched any of the boys' DNA or anything like that. Or match their database for a previous crime, anything like that. But they just lost the samples. How do you just lose the samples?
It's not surprising, though, based on what we've already discussed here.
And one of the big things in an interview that I listened to with Mara Leverett is she has been such a bloodhound on this case that she was filing Freedom of Information Acts to try to bring back some of this evidence that then they could test for DNA now. And they have, it's called like a vacuum system or something like that they use now. But when she requested this information, she requested these pieces of evidence, the police department came out and said, well, we don't have any of the evidence that actually burned up in a fire. So instead of stopping there, she then requests all of the records for fires that happened in buildings owned by the city or by the state, and goes through and double checks everything against all of these fires that they went to and responded to, and determined that none of the fires happened at any of the places where any of the evidence could be from.
Yeah.
So eventually she gets a full list of where all of these pieces of evidence are, and they are scattered all over the county in all of these different places. Some of them are at police precincts. Some of them are in storage lockers. Some of them are in like ship containers that are just sitting around degrading. Why wouldn't you keep all of this evidence in one place? Because
it's not good evidence. You're trying to fucking hide this shit.
Yeah.
Okay. We come to the guy.
One Terrence Hobbs.
So Terry Hobbs was the stepfather of why am I blanking on the name now?
Stevie Branch.
Of Stevie Branch. And what brings a lot of this stuff to light. Now, first of all, this guy is like not questioned at all during this entire process back in the early 90s. When all of this happens, this guy somehow just like slips through the fucking screens and is not spoken to at all. Now, what ends up coming to light based on when they're all searching for this new evidence and rerunning stuff is a lot of fucking Terry Hobbs. Not only were there teeth imprints on Stevie Branch's forehead that actually, now, did it match Terry Hobbs? Or, because at the same time, didn't someone get dentures replaced at some point?
So this is where things get very tricky. They find these teeth imprints. They go ahead and take dental imprints of Damien, Jessie, and Jason. They're determined to not be a match for this. Mm-hmm. Byers had actually had all of his teeth taken out and dentures put in between the trial and when they found this new evidence that they were looking for. Terry Hobbs had also done the exact same thing. Now, I'm not trying to generalize Arkansas dental health at any point in time here, but is it odd that both of these guys had all their teeth pulled out and put dentures in? Yeah. Is it beyond possibility that both at their mouths? Because unquestionably, both of these guys have done a lot of drugs in their life. Mm. And you tend to forget about oral hygiene when you're doing this many drugs. Yeah. So them losing all their teeth isn't the most shocking thing in the world. Pamela Hobbs, Terry's wife and Stevie's real mom, actually ends up turning on Terry pretty quickly after the proceedings happen. She gets a divorce based upon Terry sexually assaulting his own daughter, Amanda, that he had had with Pamela. And in this situation, when she turns on him, she says that she found a lockbox that had Terry Hobbs' partial denture that he had had during the time in his mouth when these bites could have happened. Now, I don't know if this is a scorned lover saying this because I don't think they've ever tested the partial denture.
Let's stop dancing around here.
No, but I mean, even a partial denture, you could still get a good enough match.
No, yes, absolutely.
So if they haven't tested that yet, I don't know why, if they have this partial denture. But either way, part of the reason, and we'll talk about it it's a myriad of other things, but Terry was very, very jealous of how much Pamela loved Stevie.
Doted on Stevie, yeah.
And how much she doted on him and how much attention she paid to him. And Terry had always wished that she would just pay the same amount of attention.
I think he said something along the lines of, you're spending too much time being a mother, not focusing enough on being a wife.
Yeah, so if that's the thought process and there is the jealousy there, these murders no doubt were rage-filled. There's no way that they couldn't have been.
It was determined to be that type. It was determined to be committed by one person during like the profiling, the FBI, the former FBI guy, one guy, and to have some type of personal stake essentially in it.
So Stevie having the bite mark that could potentially match Terry Hobbs' mouth wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility because it was such a violent, angry attack that happened on these kids.
Now, they also do find evidence when they were searching through and gathering evidence from the I don't like how they call them ligatures. I get the term and everything like that. But the bindings that are essentially like that were tying the kids.
We forgot to mention that about Jesse's confession.
Yeah.
He repeatedly kept saying that they were tied up with brown rope.
Yeah.
And they kept having to correct him to say white and black shoestrings.
I wish we didn't have to go back and point out other inconsistencies, but unfortunately we do. So they found a hair that was actually in the knot, which to me, there's a difference between a hair being actually in the knot to where it's been tied within the knot. So you're tying it, a hair gets pulled off your arm, something like that in the knot, and having one already attached to the shoelace and it just ending up pinched in that specific knot area. They end up doing DNA testing and how they actually, did you see how they got his DNA tested against it? So they were, they had people working on this investigation and they went over to actually interview Terry Hobbs. He acted like he knew they were coming. He invited him in and everything. And as they were inside and questioning him and everything like that, he wasn't really giving any answers. And as he got up to actually go to the bathroom or something like that, one of the people there was just like, okay, grabbed a couple of his cigarette butts.
And the reason that this all happened is because Terry Hobbs got a little too far out over his skis. Because one of the former Dixie Chicks, now the Chicks singers, Natalie Maines, had accused Terry Hobbs of doing this. Terry
didn't actually flat out accuse him, but in a way had made it seem like he was the one that would do this, enough to where he got it in his head that he could sue her, make millions of dollars
for libel
and for libel and be set. Well, even his lawyers advised against this and told him, if you get up there during a civil suit that has to do with this, they're going to ask you all of these questions that you didn't get asked because they're going to be looking at how to build your character and your believability during this suit.
Well, and during discovery, you have to give them everything.
And you're going to be under oath.
The issue with this was the cigarette butts that they collected that they found to be not dissimilar DNA found on the hairs of, and this is another big part, it was Michael's ligatures that they found them on. So not Stevie's. So even if this hair was tangled inside of Stevie's shoelaces from living with him at home, this was found on Michael's ligatures. So his shoelaces.
Yep.
The chances of that possibly happening, just transference through a home, are pretty slim to none. But it was found to be genetically similar to 1.5% of the population. So there's no way that it would have, there's a chance. There's a 1.5% chance that there was somebody out there that had this DNA. But that's not a very big number when Terry Hobbs is right there and you'd have to find somebody else within that populace to produce that DNA.
Well, so during this questioning and everything that they're questioning him during this Natalie Maines case, they're basically going through his entire history. They're like, okay, here when you were 24 years old, it shows that you broke into your neighbor's house and sexually assaulted her while she was in the shower. And by the time the cops get there, you were back at your apartment, and he's fucking like, he laughs at this stuff. And they have the woman that he had done this to do, part of the interview. After the murders and everything, he had actually got into an argument. It was at the time he was married, I think, to Natalie, and him and her brother got into an argument.
Was it Natalie Hobbs?
Yeah.
I kept saying Pam earlier. So anytime I said Pam, no, it's Natalie.
Yeah. Oh, no, sorry. I was reading Natalie Maines. Pam Hobbs, yeah.
Okay.
Gets in an argument, gets in a fight with her brother, and ends up shooting him in the abdomen. And is arrested for, it was after a domestic dispute, and basically that leads to him getting arrested. Now, also this information starts coming out from people that were kind of around during that time frame, and you hear about him doing a whole bunch of fucking laundry on the night of the murders, just running into the house, changing his clothes, doing laundry, going into Stevie's room, apparently with bleach, and wiping stuff down. Had to change his clothes the same night. People noticed that he was wearing something different. And the big fucking kicker here is that it was discovered that Terry had a pocket knife on him that Pam swears that Stevie always carried. Now, these kids were, I think they were like Cub Scouts or something. And so one of them was even wearing his like Cub Scout shirt or something like that, I think. And she was adamant, like, he does not go anywhere without this knife. And even if he went somewhere without this knife, the fact that you have this knife is way more than suspect.
Yeah, it shouldn't be in your possession. It should have been gone with everything else. How did you end up with this?
Now, one of the things too during his questioning that he did, that did happen with him was trying to determine what his alibi was. And what his alibi was is he was actually with his friend David Jacoby over at his trailer for the entire evening, and they were hanging out till way, way early, like 3 o'clock in the morning, and that's where he was. Well, it comes to find out that there was a hair sample with DNA matching his friend on the scene as well, which means that, yes, he could have been at his house, but during the documentary, they're talking to David Jacoby, and he almost kind of sets it up like a sting. He's allowing himself to be recorded and for his phone calls to be monitored while he's calling Terry Hobbs. And Terry is basically telling him what they did that night, not regarding the murder, but what he says they did that night. We were hanging out at your house. We were doing this kind of shit, whatever. And David is like, well, yeah, you came over for a little bit earlier in the evening and, you showed me some chords on the guitar and for a song, but then you left. Like you had left. And he's like, no, we were hanging out all night. He's like, remember, we were hanging out all night. And so all of a sudden during this interview, David comes to this fucking realization that he essentially was not complicit or anything like that, that he's been used to essentially get this guy off. And now this guy is making it sound like if he doesn't cooperate and go along with this story, he tells him at several points, he's like, well, these guys have been let out who they're going to go after next. They're going to go after you and me. And so it's basically scaring this guy to go along with this. Well, David ends up coming out and saying, no, like he wasn't with me all night. He wasn't with me during this time frame. So his entire alibi goes completely out the window. So at this point, during, all this investigation, during this fucking questioning, during a civil suit, when this guy thinks he's going to get millions of dollars from the fucking Dixie Chicks, all of this shit comes out pointing him as, in my opinion, the guy that fucking did this.
David Jacoby might have been getting him off in more ways than one. I guess there was kind of an unknown rumor around town that old Terry was bisexual. And there was a report from two younger boys that they went to Terry and David Jacoby because they were trying to buy weed. Terry and David Jacoby had taken these two kids, and this is I believe it's a sworn affidavit that these kids have signed. While they were over buying weed from the weed man that Terry had introduced them to, Terry and Jacoby,
Weed from the weed man.
Terry and David Jacoby start kind of roughhousing in the truck together. And supposedly when the boys had come back to the truck, Terry and David had ordered them to start wrestling with their shirts off. And there may have been some sexual conduct that happened between these. I don't want to give Aaron any credit for what he saw in the woods, but there is a chance that Aaron may have seen at this time or another time a bunch of large men who were yelling at each other in the woods and then getting naked and having sex with each other. It could have been Terry Hobbs and David Jacoby.
Well, I think the thing that solidifies it for me would be the Hobbs family secret.
Anytime there's a family secret, it's usually not good.
Basically how this came out, and I know we're getting ready to play just the tip with 3 hours here, but I promise, guys, we're almost done here. Come to find out that, so Terry Hobbs, his brother, they were over at his house, and his brother's son, so Terry's nephew, was over there with a buddy, and they wanted to go down in the basement, but Terry and his brother were already down there. So they start to go down there like, hey, we're down here talking, don't come down here. So they did what any fucking kids are going to do. They're like, oh shit, they don't want us to come down there. Let's listen in what they're talking about. And they heard during this conversation, basically Terry crying and alluding to the fact that, he killed these three boys. His brother's trying to fucking console him. There's interviews with Terry's fucking sister. This fucking family, I'm sorry. I'm 3 hours into this and I've been listening to this shit for the last week. So I'm kind of upset about it. Fuck this whole family. They need to fucking drink bleach. But they're just adamant that, yeah, it couldn't have been Terry despite all of this fucking previous violent shit and everything. But they overhear him talking about this. During another time, the same friend that is with Terry's nephew, they're going and picking up Terry's nephew with another friend, like at a bus stop or something like that. They go to pick him up and the nephew is just like just not acting normal. He's not being himself. They're like, hey man, what's going on? And he's like, you know, those 3 kids that got murdered in West Memphis. He's like, my uncle did that. And they're like, what? And didn't know if he was joking or not, but it was apparently dead serious about it. He's like, I've been thinking about it all day. I don't know what to make of it. He's like, but yeah, he killed those 3 kids in West Memphis. He's like, it's what we know as the Hobbs family secret, apparently. He's like, you have no idea what would happen, like, if they knew that I told you guys about this. Well, unfortunately, fucking Terry Hobbs is no longer amongst, both fortunately and unfortunately, he's no longer fucking with the living.
Did he die?
Yeah.
The fact that we didn't get a
That's what I'm saying.
deathbed confession is pretty frustrating.
But this guy was just the greatest A of the biggest pieces of shit that could fucking exist on the planet. I'm very, very, very convinced it was Terry Hobbs. When you just see the way that he acts, especially during the interview or during the questioning, during the civil suit and everything, about just how fucking nonchalant he is about the shit that he's done and like the violence and everything like that. This is definitely, much like they said, and they wanted to pin it on fucking Damien Echols about it. You look at him and he looks like the type of person that fucking would do this. Oh, yeah. He sounds like the type of fucking person that would do this.
Yeah, I don't really, there's no doubt in my mind that it was him. And again, talk about motive. Did he have a motive to do this? Yes.
The strongest motive out of anyone that they suspected, most definitely.
Did he have the opportunity to do this?
Yes.
David Jacoby cleared it out for yes. Did he have not information, but did he have physical evidence that probably only the person...
He was the last one seen with the kids.
Yeah.
Neighbors have said he came out to search for the kids. They started riding off. He was following them back. He was the last one that was seen with them.
There's too many fingers that point at Terry Hobbs, and even Byers at the point in time when he was advocating for the 3 boys to be released, he was firmly pointing the finger at Terry Hobbs.
Enough so to where when they were at the courthouse during the time frame when the others were going to get released, the 3 of them were getting released, Terry Hobbs was fucking there, and Byers was talking to reporters. And as Terry's like, I got to go right now, and he starts to walk in the building, all of a sudden you hear Byers in the background being like, there's the baby killer. Yeah, and then the camera pans over and he's like, what? I can say it, it's a free country. Not saying anything about Byers because he's still like, the dude just looks fucking weird.
Yeah, great asshole too.
But at the same time, like he's dead on right about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, over the course of 3 hours, I think we solved the West Memphis Three case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good on us.
Definitely, if you want more information on this stuff, I would again say take any of this with caution. Maybe read The Devil's Knot. I don't know if there's any pictures in it. Those are the books that I like. But
picture books, not murder picture books.
Yeah.
Okay.
Check this stuff out. Devil's Knot's great. Mara Leverett, Paradise Lost 1, 2, and 3, Bruce Sanofsky and Joe Berlinger, West of Memphis, Peter Jackson. I mean, it's Peter Jackson. The guy did a phenomenal job with the documentary. Mm-hmm. And it took us a lot to kind of get through this because this is just a very brutal topic to go through. Hopefully we kept it light enough for you. I mean, this is huge just in the history of not
Fuck
really
ups.
Our court system, but just it's a part of life that people don't really talk about is not only the judicial system, but people that were falsely accused of things that they have to try to fight through to get off. This isn't a one-off case. When we do the Satanic Panic episode, we're going to bring you some wild shit with that too, because all of this stuff is crazy, but it goes beyond that. There's, I wouldn't say so many people, but there's statistically a non-zero part of the prison population that were accused and convicted of things that they just didn't do, but they were in a situation like these 3 where they couldn't afford a private lawyer. There was a point in time, again, that I have to go back to because it's such a big thing that Damien talks about in the book. He said that his grandma sold her wedding ring and her engagement ring so she could provide enough money to get Damien legal counsel. And as he was being questioned, the police refused to let the lawyer into the police station and then cited that Damien said that he never asked for counsel, so they didn't have to let him in. It's shit like that that happens to poor people on a regular basis because they can't afford private practice lawyers to come in there and protect them. And the whole court system is so jammed full of shit through petty drug charges and other things that could be settled so many different ways, that these public defenders don't have the time and ability to protect everybody the same way equally, and they end up falling on plea deals, or they end up falling behind. Damien said that he saw his lawyer a handful of times before he was going on trial for capital fucking murder, because they are so busy and they don't always get it right. But regardless, at the end of the day, whether they gave you the best possible protection as a lawyer or the worst possible protection as a lawyer, they're public defenders. They get paid the same way every single time.
Yep. If stuff like this interests you, I definitely recommend checking out like the Innocence Project and everything. It's a great organization, does a lot of good. And then might be a few weeks, maybe a few months before we do any more true crime for me. I'd like to take a little bit of a breather from it and just talk about, war and shit like that doesn't hit so close to home. But yeah, guys, thanks for hanging in this one with us. I know it was a long one, but we had to try to do it justice. You got anything else?
No.
All right, guys. Well, we are going to catch you on the next one. Everyone have a good one.
Peace.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us for another episode. If you like what you heard, hit that subscribe and like button. Follow us. If you didn't like what you heard, still hit that anyway, because we'll probably cover something in the future that you do like. Please follow us on our social media. Adam, hit them with it.
Our Instagram is Historically High Pod, Historically High POD, and we are on Twitter at Historically High. That's Historically HI.
All right. And if you guys want to send in any feedback, suggestions, hit us up on those two, or you can even do it on Gmail. It's historicallyhighpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks again.
Peace.